Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The weather reports had been warning about the storm system moving through West Virginia for 3 days, but Abner Whitlock had a delivery schedule to keep. 23 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler had taught him plenty about dangerous conditions, and he figured this would be just another rough night on the mountain passes. The load of industrial equipment needed to reach Pittsburgh by morning, and the bonus for on-time delivery would cover his daughter's college textbooks for the semester. That kind of money made the risk seem worthwhile, or at least that's what he kept telling himself as he watched the dark clouds gathering over the Appalachian ridges. The first drops of rain hit his windshield just after he crossed into Fayette County on Route 19. It was nearly 8 in the evening, and the October sun had already disappeared behind the mountains, leaving only a faint orange glow bleeding through the storm clouds. Abner reached for his CB radio, scanning through the channels to catch any chatter from other truckers about road conditions ahead. Most of the frequencies were quiet, just static, and the occasional burst of garbled transmission. The isolation didn't bother him much anymore. After 2 decades of driving these routes, he'd grown accustomed to the loneliness that came with the territory. But tonight, something about the empty airwaves made him uneasy. The rain intensified as he climbed higher into the mountains, turning from scattered drops to sheets of water that his wipers could barely handle. The headlights of his Peterbilt carved twin tunnels through the darkness, illuminating maybe 30 feet of slick asphalt before everything disappeared into a wall of rain and mist. He'd driven through plenty of storms, but this one had teeth. The wind came in sudden gusts that pushed his loaded trailer sideways, forcing him to constantly correct his steering. Each time the trailer swayed, he could feel the weight of the industrial machinery shifting, testing the limits of the tie-down straps. About an hour into the storm, he caught sight of a faded road sign through the rain. Beckwith, 5 miles. He knew the name from old maps, though he'd never had reason to stop there. Beckwith had been a coal mining town back in the early 1900s, one of dozens that dotted these mountains before the mines played out and the people moved on. According to the stories he'd heard at truck stops over the years, the place had been completely abandoned since the late 60s when the last mine closed after a cave-in killed 13 men. The state kept the exit open as an emergency turnoff, but there was nothing there anymore except rotting buildings and bad memories. The rain turned to hail just as he passed the Beckwith exit sign. Chunks of ice the size of marbles hammered against his cab, creating a deafening roar that drowned out even the sound of his diesel engine. The temperature gauge on his dashboard showed it had dropped 15 degrees in the last 10 minutes, and he could see his breath fogging in the cab despite the heater running full blast. This wasn't just a storm anymore. It was turning into something worse. The rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him safe through 23 years of driving, was telling him to pull off and wait it out. He almost missed the movement in his side mirror. Through the chaos of rain and hail, he caught a glimpse of something on the shoulder of the road. It looked like a person, standing perfectly still despite the violence of the storm. No rain gear, no umbrella, just standing there watching his truck pass. Abner's first instinct was to stop and offer help, but something about the figure's stillness, the unnatural way they stood unmoved by the wind and rain, made him keep driving. He checked his mirror again, but the figure had already vanished into the darkness behind him. The hail grew larger, golf ball-sized chunks now slamming into his truck with enough force to leave dents. The windshield developed a spiderweb crack in the upper corner, and Abner knew he couldn't keep going. The next exit was 15 miles away, too far in these conditions. He'd have to double back to Beckwith and find somewhere to wait out the worst of the storm. The thought of stopping in that abandoned town made his skin crawl, but staying on the road would be suicide. He took the exit slowly, his headlights sweeping across a rusted sign that read, "Welcome to Beckwith, coal capital of Fayette County." Someone had spray-painted over it years ago with words he couldn't make out through the rain. The exit ramp was in worse shape than the highway, full of potholes and cracks where weeds had pushed through the asphalt. His truck bounced and rattled as he descended into the valley where the town lay hidden. The main street of Beckwith appeared through the storm like something from a nightmare. 2 rows of abandoned buildings lined the road, their windows either boarded up or gaping open like dead eyes. The architectural style belonged to another era, all red brick and ornate stonework that had been beautiful once, but now seemed to loom threateningly in the darkness. Street lamps that hadn't functioned in decades stood at tilted angles, their glass globes shattered. The only light came from his headlights reflecting off the rain-slicked street and the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the dead town in stark, terrifying detail. He drove slowly down Main Street, looking for somewhere to park his rig safely. Most of the buildings were too close together, without enough clearance for his trailer. The rain hammered against his cab relentlessly, and the wind howled through the empty structures on either side of him. About halfway through town, he spotted what looked like an old gas station with a wide lot out front. The canopy had partially collapsed, but there was enough space to pull his truck in and get some shelter from the worst of the storm. As he maneuvered his rig into the lot, his headlights swept across the front of the gas station. The windows were intact but filmed with decades of grime, and he could make out the shapes of old pumps that hadn't dispensed fuel since the Johnson administration. But what made him pause was the light he thought he saw inside the building. Just a flicker of something that disappeared as soon as his headlights moved past. He told himself it was just a reflection, a trick of the lightning, but his hands were trembling slightly as he set the parking brake. The storm raged around him, but inside the cab, he was relatively safe and dry. He reached for his thermos of coffee, now lukewarm, and took a long drink while watching the rain cascade down his windshield. The radio was nothing but static on every channel, not even the emergency broadcast system coming through. His cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't surprising this deep in the mountains. He was completely cut off from the outside world, alone in a dead town with only the storm for company. That's when he heard the sound of breaking glass. It was distinct even over the storm, the sharp crack and tinkle of a window shattering somewhere nearby. Abner peered through his rain-streaked windows, trying to see what had caused it. Maybe the wind had finally blown out one of the old windows, or maybe hail had broken through. But as he watched, he saw movement in one of the buildings across the street. A shadow passed by a second-floor window, too deliberate to be caused by the storm. He wasn't alone in Beckwith. The rational explanation was that someone else had sought shelter from the storm. Maybe another trucker or a traveler caught in the weather. But something about the movement he'd seen, the way the shadow had seemed to pause at the window as if watching him, made his skin prickle with unease. He locked his doors, a gesture that felt both necessary and futile. If someone wanted to break into his truck, a locked door wouldn't stop them, but it made him feel marginally safer. Another flash of lightning illuminated the street, and in that brief moment of brilliant white light, Abner saw them. Figures standing in the doorways of the abandoned buildings, motionless despite the wind and rain. At least 4 that he could count in that split second before darkness returned. They were wearing what looked like old mining gear, the kind with the helmet lamps, though no lights shone from them. They stood perfectly still, facing his truck, as if they'd been waiting for him. His heart hammered in his chest as he fumbled for his keys. He needed to get out of here, storm or no storm. But when he turned the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. He tried again with the same result. The battery was fine, all his electrical systems were working, but the engine wouldn't catch. Through the rain, he could see the figures beginning to move, stepping out from the doorways and into the street. They moved wrong, their gait stiff and unnatural, like they were fighting against joints that hadn't been used in years. The radio suddenly burst to life, making him jump. Through the static came a voice, distorted and barely human. 13 souls for the mountain. 13 souls for the coal. You came to Beckwith in the storm, trucker. The mountain demands its due. The transmission cut off, returning to static, but Abner could hear something else now. Singing. Somewhere in the storm, multiple voices were singing what sounded like an old mining song, the kind workers would sing to keep rhythm while they worked. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the abandoned buildings and mixing with the howl of the wind. He tried the engine again, pumping the gas pedal and muttering prayers he hadn't said since childhood. This time it caught, roaring to life with a sound that had never been more beautiful to his ears. He didn't wait to see how close the figures had gotten. He threw the truck into gear and gunned it out of the gas station lot, his trailer fishtailing as he hit the wet street. In his mirrors, illuminated by his taillights, he could see them following. Not running, just walking with that same unnatural gait, but somehow keeping pace with his truck as he accelerated. The road out of Beckwith climbed steeply back toward the highway, and his truck struggled with the grade in the terrible conditions. The speedometer showed he was doing 30, but it felt like he was crawling. The singing grew louder, and now he could make out the words, "Down in the mine, where the sun don't shine, 13 men lay their heads. The mountain took what the mountains owed, and 13 more it fed." Over and over, the verse repeated, growing louder and more distorted with each repetition. His windshield cracked further as something struck it. Not hail this time, but what looked like a chunk of coal. More pieces began hitting his truck, thrown from the darkness on either side of the road. Each impact left a black smear on his windshield, making it harder to see. The figures were still behind him. He could see them every time lightning flashed, maintaining that impossible walking pace that somehow kept them close to his struggling truck. The exit ramp finally appeared through the rain, and Abner took it at a dangerous speed, his trailer swaying sickeningly as he merged back onto the highway. He didn't slow down, didn't look back, just kept driving through the storm with his cracked windshield and dented cab. The singing faded gradually, swallowed by distance and rain, but he didn't feel safe until he'd put 50 miles between himself and Beckwith. He drove straight through to Pittsburgh without stopping, arriving at dawn with his cargo intact, but his nerves shattered. When he told his dispatcher about the detour to Beckwith, the man looked at him strangely. "Beckwith? That exit's been closed for 5 years, Abner. State condemned the ramp after it partially collapsed." But Abner knew what he'd seen, what he'd experienced. The dents in his cab and the coal dust embedded in his windshield cracks were proof enough for him. He found a newspaper article later, searching through online archives during a sleepless night. October 15, 1968. Mine collapse kills 13 in Beckwith. The date caught his attention. He'd driven through Beckwith on October 15th, exactly 55 years after the disaster. The article mentioned that the bodies were never recovered, the mine shaft having collapsed so completely that rescue efforts were abandoned after a week. 13 miners entombed forever in the mountain, their families left to grieve without even bodies to bury. There was something else in the article that made his blood run cold. A survivor, a man named Foster McQuaid, who'd been running late to his shift that day, told reporters that the mine had been showing signs of instability for weeks. The company had ignored the warnings, pushing the men to keep working despite the danger. "The mountain was angry," McQuaid was quoted as saying. "It had given us its coal for years, and we kept taking more. The mountain always collects what it's owed, one way or another. Abner Whitlock didn't sleep for 3 days after the incident at Beckwith. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those figures walking through the storm, heard that infernal singing echoing through the mountains. His wife noticed the change immediately when he got home from the Pittsburgh run. The dents in his truck, the coal dust still embedded in the windshield cracks, the way his hands trembled when he tried to drink his morning coffee. She didn't push him to talk about it, but he could see the worry in her eyes every time she looked at him. The company wanted him back on the road within the week. There were loads to haul, schedules to keep, and Abner had never missed more than a day or two of work in his entire career. But something fundamental had changed in him during that storm. The thought of driving through those mountain passes again, especially at night, made his stomach clench with a fear he'd never experienced before. He told his dispatcher he needed some time off, maybe a week or two to deal with some personal matters. The man wasn't happy about it, but Abner had enough seniority and goodwill built up over the years that they couldn't really refuse him. He spent those days researching, diving deep into the history of Beckwith and the surrounding area. The town library in Charleston had old newspapers on microfilm, and he sat there for hours, scrolling through decades of history, looking for answers to questions he couldn't quite articulate. The mine collapse in 1968 was well documented, but there were other incidents too, stretching back to when the mines first opened in 1902. Cave-ins, explosions, fires that burned for weeks underground. The mountains had claimed hundreds of lives over the years, swallowing men whole and sometimes never giving them back. What disturbed him most were the patterns he began to notice. Every few years, there would be reports of strange incidents during storms, travelers claiming to see lights in the abandoned town, voices calling from the empty mine shafts, figures walking the streets in outdated mining gear. The reports were always dismissed as hallucinations brought on by the weather, tricks of light and shadow in the rain, but there were too many of them to ignore, and they all shared similar details. The walking figures, the singing, the sense of being watched and followed. One article from 1979 caught his attention particularly. A trucker named Solomon Harwick had reported being chased out of Beckwith during a severe thunderstorm. His description matched Abner's experience almost exactly, right down to the chunks of coal being thrown at his vehicle. Harwick had been so shaken by the experience that he'd quit trucking altogether, moving to Florida and taking a job at a marina. The newspaper had treated it as a human interest story, a curiosity piece about the power of mountain legends to affect the human mind. But Abner knew better. Harwick had seen the same things he had. He tried to find Foster McQuaid, the survivor mentioned in the 1968 article, but the trail went cold after the mid-70s. The man had lived in Beckwith for a few years after the disaster, one of the last holdouts as the town slowly died around him. Then he simply vanished from the records. No death certificate, no forwarding address, just gone. Some of the other survivors' families had similar stories. They'd stayed in the area for a while, then disappeared without explanation. It was as if the mountain had eventually claimed them too, just on a delay. His research was interrupted one evening by a phone call from his dispatcher. There was a priority load that needed to go through West Virginia, and they were short on drivers. The regular route would take him within 20 miles of Beckwith, though he wouldn't need to go through the town itself. The pay was double the normal rate, hazard pay for dealing with another storm system that was moving through the area. Abner's first instinct was to refuse, but the rational part of his mind argued that he was being foolish. He'd driven these roads for decades without incident. One bad experience shouldn't define his entire career. Against his better judgment, he accepted the job. His wife begged him not to go, said she had a bad feeling about it, but he assured her he'd be fine. He wouldn't go near Beckwith, wouldn't even take that exit no matter what happened. It was just another run through the mountains, something he'd done 1,000 times before. But as he climbed into his cab and started the engine, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. The storm hit earlier than predicted, catching him still 50 miles from his destination. It wasn't as severe as the one 2 weeks ago, but the rain was steady and the wind strong enough to make driving treacherous. He kept his speed down, focused on the road, and tried not to think about how familiar it all felt. The radio was working this time, picking up a classic rock station out of Charleston, and he turned it up loud to drown out the sound of rain on his cab. He was making good time despite the weather when he saw the woman standing on the side of the road. She was maybe 40 years old, wearing a rain slicker and holding what looked like a gas can. Her car was nowhere to be seen, which was strange, but Abner figured it must have broken down further back, and she was walking to get fuel. Every instinct told him to keep driving, but he couldn't just leave someone stranded in this weather. He slowed down and pulled over about 50 feet ahead of her. She approached his passenger door and he rolled down the window just enough to talk. The rain was driving hard, and she had to shout to be heard. "Thank you for stopping. My car died about a mile back. I was hoping to catch a ride to the next gas station." Her accent was local, thick with the West Virginia hills, and her face was weathered in the way of people who'd lived hard lives in these mountains. Something about her seemed familiar, though Abner couldn't place it. "Where's your car exactly?" he asked, scanning his mirrors for any sign of a vehicle on the shoulder behind them. The woman pointed vaguely back down the road, but in the rain and darkness he couldn't see anything. His unease grew, but she looked genuinely distressed, water streaming down her face, shivering in the cold. "The next station is about 10 miles, he said finally. "I can give you a ride that far." She climbed into the cab, bringing the smell of rain and something else with her, something earthen and old, like soil that had been disturbed after lying undisturbed for years. As she settled into the passenger seat, Abner got a better look at her face in the cab's interior light. There was something off about her features, a grayish pallor to her skin that the cold couldn't quite explain. Her eyes were dark, almost black in the dim light, and they seemed to look through him rather than at him. "I appreciate this," she said, her voice different now that she was out of the rain, deeper and with an odd resonance. Not many folks would stop in weather like this, especially not around here. She paused, then added, "You know where we are, don't you? This stretch of road?" Abner's hands tightened on the wheel. They were about 5 miles from the Beckwith exit, though he hadn't wanted to think about it. "Yeah, I know where we are," he said carefully, keeping his eyes on the road. The woman nodded slowly, water still dripping from her hair onto his seat. "My family's from Beckwith," she said, and Abner's blood turned cold. "My name's Sybil Harper. My daddy worked the mines before the collapse. Lost him when I was just a girl." The name Harper rang a bell from his research. There had been 3 Harpers among the 13 men killed in 1968, but that would make this woman. The math didn't work. She looked 40 at most, which would mean she wasn't even born when the mine collapsed. "I'm sorry for your loss," Abner managed, his mouth dry despite the humidity in the cab. Sybil turned to look at him fully, and in the brief illumination of passing lightning, her face seemed to shift and change, aging decades in an instant before returning to its previous appearance. "Loss," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's a funny way to put it. They're not lost. They're still here, still in the mountain. The mountain keeps everything it takes." The radio crackled and went to static, then began picking up fragments of what sounded like old transmissions, voices from CB radios that hadn't been used in years. Trucker call signs from the 70s and 80s, people reporting road conditions, checking on each other, all overlapping in a chaotic mess of sound. Through it all, Abner could hear that singing again, faint but unmistakable. Down in the mine where the sun don't shine. You need to let me out, Sybil said suddenly, her voice urgent. Right here. Now. They were in the middle of nowhere, no gas station in sight, no buildings, nothing but dark forest on either side of the road. There's nothing here, Abner protested, but she was already reaching for the door handle. Stop the truck, she demanded, and something in her voice made him comply, pulling over to the shoulder. She opened the door and stepped out into the storm, then turned back to look at him. In the red glow of his tail lights, her face was completely different, older, ancient even, with skin like worn leather and eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. You came back, she said, though her mouth didn't move quite right with the words. The mountain remembers you. It marked you that night in Beckwith. You can leave these roads, but you'll always come back. They all do eventually. She walked into the forest, disappearing between the trees, and Abner saw others waiting for her in the darkness. Shapes that might have been people once, standing perfectly still despite the wind and rain. He slammed the door and gunned the engine, tearing back onto the road with his trailer fishtailing behind him. The radio continued its cascade of phantom transmissions, voices from the past bleeding through into the present. He drove faster than was safe in the storm, trying to put distance between himself and whatever he'd just encountered. But as he passed the Beckwith exit, his engine began to sputter. Not again, he thought desperately, pressing harder on the accelerator. The sputtering worsened, and he could smell something burning, something that reminded him of coal. The temperature gauge was normal, all his instruments showed everything was fine, but the truck was dying just like it had 2 weeks ago. This time, he didn't even consider taking the exit. He let the truck coast as far as it would go, eventually rolling to a stop on the shoulder about a mile past Beckwith. The engine was completely dead, and this time he knew it wasn't mechanical failure. Something wanted him here, wanted him close to that cursed town. He tried his cell phone, but the screen was black, completely dead despite being fully charged when he left. The CB radio produced only static now, not even the ghost voices coming through. He sat in his cab, watching the mirrors, waiting for them to come. The rain hammered against the windows, and the wind rocked the trailer, but for a long time, nothing else happened. Then he saw the lights. Not headlights from vehicles, but smaller lights, bobbing and weaving through the rain. Mining helmets, he realized. Dozens of them emerging from the forest on both sides of the road, converging on his truck. They moved in that same unnatural way he remembered, stiff and mechanical, as if their bodies were being operated by something that didn't quite remember how human movement worked. As they got closer, he could see their faces, or what remained of them. Gray skin stretched tight over skulls, eyes that were just dark holes, mouths that opened and closed without sound. They were singing, he could feel it more than hear it, the vibration traveling through the ground and into his truck. One of them approached his door, and Abner recognized the uniform despite its deteriorated state. The name tag was still visible. McQuaid. Foster McQuaid. The survivor who had been running late that day in 1968. But he hadn't survived, Abner realized. None of them had survived. The mountain had claimed them all eventually, one way or another, and now they served it, bringing it new offerings. McQuaid raised his hand and knocked on the door. 3 slow, deliberate raps that echoed through the cab. When Abner didn't respond, he knocked again, harder this time. The others had surrounded the truck now, dozens of figures in mining gear, all standing perfectly still in the storm. Waiting. The knocking came again, and this time Abner heard McQuaid's voice, distorted and hollow but still understandable. "Open up, trucker." The mountain wants to meet you properly this time." Abner's hand moved toward the door handle against his will, his muscles responding to something other than his own commands. He fought against it, gripping the steering wheel with his other hand, but the compulsion was strong. The door locks clicked open by themselves and the door began to swing wide. The storm rushed in, carrying with it the smell of coal dust and decay, and Foster McQuaid stood there, his hollow eyes somehow still capable of expressing a terrible patience. "You can't fight the mountain," McQuaid said, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "It's been here longer than anything else, older than the towns, older than the roads. We dug too deep, took too much, and now we belong to it. But it's not satisfied with just us anymore. 13 souls weren't enough. It wants more. It wants everyone who travels these roads, everyone who comes close enough to hear its call." Abner found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "I won't. I'm not going with you." McQuaid tilted his head, a gesture that looked wrong with his deteriorated neck. "You don't have a choice. You've breathed in the coal dust. It's in your lungs now, in your blood. Every time you close your eyes, you'll see us. Every time you drive these roads, your engine will fail near Beckwith. And eventually, when you're too tired to fight anymore, you'll take that exit one last time." The figures began to move closer, reaching out with hands that were more bone than flesh. But just as they were about to touch him, another sound cut through the storm. A horn, loud and long, from another truck approaching from behind. The figures froze, then began retreating back towards the forest. McQuaid lingered for a moment longer. "This isn't over, trucker. The mountain is patient. It has all the time in the world." The rescue truck pulled up behind Abner's rig, and a driver jumped out, running through the rain with a flashlight. By the time he reached Abner's cab, the figures were gone, melted back into the darkness of the forest. The driver helped Abner get his truck started, following him the rest of the way to his destination to make sure he made it safely. Abner didn't tell him about the figures or McQuaid. How could he? Who would believe him? But the worst part was what he found when he got home. In researching Foster McQuaid more thoroughly, digging through genealogy websites and old census records, he discovered something that made his blood freeze. McQuaid had had a daughter, born in 1950. Her name was Sybil, and she'd married a man named Harper in 1971. According to the records, she'd died in a car accident in 1985, on the road near Beckwith during a severe thunderstorm. Her body was never recovered. The woman he'd picked up, the one who'd sat in his cab and spoken to him, had been dead for almost 40 years, but somehow the mountain had sent her to him, used her to deliver its message. And now, every night when he tried to sleep, he could feel the coal dust in his lungs, hear the singing in the distance, and know that McQuaid had been right. The mountain had marked him, and sooner or later he would return to Beckwith. They all did eventually. He quit trucking after that, took a job at a warehouse in town where he never had to drive at night, never had to go near the mountains. But sometimes during storms he could still hear them calling, the 13 souls of Beckwith and all the others the mountain had claimed over the years, calling him home to the darkness under the earth, where the sun don't shine and the coal dust fills your lungs forever. 6 months passed after Abner Whitlock quit trucking. 6 months of warehouse work and sleepless nights and trying to convince himself that what happened on those mountain roads had been some kind of breakdown, a hallucination brought on by too many years of solitary driving. His wife watched him deteriorate, saw how he jumped at shadows and avoided driving anywhere after dark. She suggested therapy, maybe medication, but Abner knew that no psychiatrist could help with what plagued him. The coal dust in his lungs was real, even if no X-ray could detect it. The singing in his dreams was real, even if no one else could hear it. The warehouse job paid less than half what he'd made as a trucker, and the bills were piling up. His daughter's college tuition was due, the mortgage payment was late, and his wife had started taking extra shifts at the hospital to make ends meet. Every day, his old dispatcher would call, offering him premium rates to come back, promising the best routes that avoided the mountains entirely. But Abner knew better. He understood now that the mountain's reach extended beyond geography. Once it marked you, distance was just an illusion. It was his daughter who finally broke his resolve. She came home from college for Thanksgiving, and he could see the worry in her eyes when she looked at him. He'd lost 30 pounds, his hair had gone completely gray, and his hands shook constantly now. Over dinner, she mentioned that she might have to drop out, take a semester off to work, and save money. The scholarship covered tuition, but not books or housing, and her part-time job at the campus library wasn't enough. The look of disappointment in her eyes, the death of dreams he saw there, was worse than any supernatural terror. The next morning, he called his dispatcher. There was a high-paying route available, hauling medical equipment from Atlanta to Cleveland. It would take him through West Virginia, but on the interstate, a good 40 miles from Beckwith. The dispatcher promised it would be a daylight run, no night driving required. The pay would cover his daughter's expenses for the entire semester. Abner's hand shook as he held the phone, but he heard himself accepting the job. His wife pleaded with him not to go, said the money wasn't worth it, that they'd figure something else out. But Abner had already made up his mind. He'd face the mountain one more time, prove to himself that its hold over him was just psychological, just trauma that he could overcome. He spent the week before the run preparing, buying new maps that showed alternate routes, checking and double-checking weather forecasts, making sure his truck was in perfect mechanical condition. He even went to church for the first time in 20 years, though he wasn't sure if any god had power over something as old and dark as what lived in those mountains. The morning of the run dawned clear and bright, not a cloud in the sky. The weather forecast showed clear conditions for the next 3 days, no storm systems anywhere near the Appalachians. Abner kissed his wife goodbye, trying not to notice how she clung to him like she might never see him again, and climbed into his cab. The engine started smooth and strong, all systems running perfectly. He pulled out of the depot, telling himself this was just another run, just another day of work. The first few hours went perfectly. Traffic was light, the weather held, and his truck ran like a dream. He made good time through Georgia and into Tennessee, stopping only for fuel and coffee. The mountains rose around him as he entered the Appalachians, but in daylight they seemed less threatening, just ancient rocks covered in autumn trees. He kept the radio on, scanning through stations to keep his mind occupied, refusing to let the silence creep in. It was near the Virginia-West Virginia border when things started to go wrong. First, his radio began picking up static, brief interruptions in the music that lasted just long enough to be noticeable. Then his GPS started glitching, showing his position jumping around on the map, sometimes placing him miles from where he actually was. The temperature gauge flickered, showing normal one moment and redline the next, though the engine temperature was clearly fine. He was still 40 miles from Beckwith, taking the interstate route that bypassed it entirely, when he saw the first sign. It was new, or at least looked new, professional highway signage that read, "Beckwith Historical Site. Next exit. Experience the mining heritage of West Virginia." His blood went cold. There had never been a historical site at Beckwith. The town had been abandoned for over 50 years, left to rot in the valley. But there was the sign, official and undeniable. More signs appeared as he drove. Beckwith Mining Museum, 2 miles. Historic Beckwith, preserved mining town next right. Each one looked perfectly legitimate, the kind of brown historical markers you'd see at any heritage site. But Abner knew they were lying. There was no museum, no preserved anything, just an abandoned town full of shadows and things that should be dead. His phone rang, which should have been impossible since he'd turned it off before leaving, specifically to avoid distractions. The screen showed a number he didn't recognize, a local West Virginia area code. Against his better judgment, he answered it. The voice on the other end was Foster McQuaid's, hollow and distant, but unmistakable. "You're getting close, trucker. The mountain's been preparing for you. It's moved things around, made some changes. You can take the interstate all you want, but all roads lead to Beckwith now." The line went dead before Abner could respond. He threw the phone onto the passenger seat and pressed harder on the accelerator. He just needed to get past this section, get through West Virginia and into Ohio. A few more hours, and he'd be safe. But as he rounded the next curve, he saw something that made his heart stop. The interstate ahead was blocked, not by traffic or an accident, but by what looked like a massive coal slide that had covered all 4 lanes. Official detour signs directed traffic off the next exit, which according to the sign led to Beckwith. He pulled over to the shoulder, his hands shaking as he grabbed his atlas. The map showed the interstate clear and unobstructed. No alternate routes in this area except through the mountain passes. But the coal slide was undeniably real, black rock piled 20 feet high across the highway. Other vehicles were already taking the detour, following the signs without question. Abner watched them go, normal people in normal cars, having no idea what they were driving toward. He had 2 choices: turn back, abandon the run and the money his daughter needed, or follow the detour through Beckwith. The rational part of his mind said the town couldn't hurt him in broad daylight, with other traffic around. Whatever haunted that place seemed bound to storms and darkness, but his instincts screamed at him to turn around, to get as far from here as possible. A state trooper pulled up behind him, lights flashing. The officer approached his window, looking tired and irritated. "You need to keep moving, sir. Can't have trucks blocking the shoulder. Detour's clearly marked." Abner wanted to warn him, to explain why the detour was dangerous, but how could he? The officer would think he was insane. "How long has the road been blocked?" Abner asked instead. The trooper looked confused. "Blocked? What are you talking about? Road's clear ahead." Abner looked forward, and his heart sank. The coal slide was gone. The interstate stretched clear and empty ahead, no obstruction in sight. But the detour signs remained, and now the trooper was directing him toward them. "Take the detour, sir. Construction work ahead. Interstate's closed for the next 10 miles. The officer's eyes were wrong, Abner realized. They had that same hollow quality he'd seen in McQuaid's face, like something was looking out through them that wasn't quite human. With no choice, Abner followed the detour signs. The exit ramp curved down into a valley he didn't remember from his previous trips, though he must have passed it hundreds of times. The road was newer than it should be, smooth asphalt with fresh yellow lines, not the cracked and weed-choked pavement he remembered. Other vehicles traveled alongside him, but their windows were dark, and he couldn't see the drivers inside. The signs for Beckwith began immediately. "Welcome to historic Beckwith, a living monument to West Virginia's mining heritage." The road wound down into the valley, and Abner could see the town ahead, but it wasn't the abandoned ruin he remembered. Buildings that had been collapsing were now restored, painted in bright colors that belonged to another era. The streets were clean, lined with functioning street lamps that shouldn't exist, and there were people, dozens of them, walking the sidewalks in period clothing like actors at a historical recreation. He drove slowly down Main Street, his truck seeming out of place among the restored storefronts and carefully maintained facades. The gas station where he'd parked during the storm was now a gleaming vintage service station, complete with attendants in 1950s uniforms. The other vehicles that had taken the detour were nowhere to be seen, as if they'd simply vanished once they entered the town. A woman stepped into the street ahead of him, forcing him to stop. It was Sybil Harper, but not as she'd appeared in his truck that night. She looked younger, healthier, dressed in a pristine 1960s dress with her hair perfectly styled. She walked to his driver's side window and smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome back, Mr. Whitlock. We've been preparing for your visit. The museum is just ahead, in the old company store. Foster's waiting for you there." Abner kept his hands on the wheel, fighting the urge to floor it and try to escape. "This isn't real," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sybil's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Real is a funny concept, Mr. Whitlock. This town is as real as the mountain wants it to be. Some days it's ruins, some days it's like this. Today, for you, it's showing its best face. The museum has something special prepared, just for you." She stepped back, gesturing for him to continue forward. The other pedestrians had stopped walking and were all facing his truck now, watching with those hollow eyes. Men in mining gear, women in vintage dresses, children in old-fashioned school clothes. None of them moved, none of them blinked. They just stood and stared as he drove past. The company store loomed ahead, a 3-story brick building that had been a burnt-out shell the last time he'd seen it. Now it stood pristine, with Beckwith Mining Museum painted in gold letters above the entrance. The parking lot was empty except for a single vehicle, an old pickup truck that looked familiar. As Abner pulled in, he realized it was the same truck that had stopped that first night, the one driven by the man who'd offered to help him. He sat in his cab for a long moment, engine idling, debating whether to go inside. But he knew he didn't really have a choice. The mountain had orchestrated this, brought him here for a purpose. Until he faced whatever was in that museum, it wouldn't let him leave. Every road would lead back to Beckwith. Every detour would circle around to this moment. The museum's front door was open, spilling cool air that smelled of coal dust and something else, something organic and wrong. Abner climbed down from his cab, his legs unsteady, and walked toward the entrance. The street behind him had gone completely silent, even the sound of his still-running truck seeming muffled and distant. At the threshold he paused, looking back to see all the townspeople had moved closer, forming a semicircle around his truck. Inside, the museum was dark despite the daylight outside. Display cases lined the walls, filled with mining equipment, old photographs, and newspaper clippings. But the photos were wrong. They showed faces he recognized, people who shouldn't be in pictures from the early 1900s. His own face stared back at him from a group photo labeled Beckwith Mining Crew, 1913. In the image, he stood among 13 miners, all with those hollow eyes, all wearing expressions of terrible resignation. Foster McQuaid emerged from the shadows between displays, looking more solid than he had during their last encounter. He wore a suit now, formal and old-fashioned, like a funeral director from another era. "Welcome to our museum, Mr. Whitlock. We've been collecting for a long time. Every person who's driven these roads, everyone who's been touched by the mountain, has a place here. Your place has been waiting since before you were born." The displays changed as Abner watched, the photographs shifting to show different scenes. His truck appearing in images from the 1930s, 1980s, 1950s. Always the same truck, always with him at the wheel, even in pictures that predated his birth by decades. In some images he was alone. In others, shadowy figures filled his cab, passengers he didn't remember picking up. "The mountain exists outside of time," McQuaid explained, his voice echoing strangely in the dark space. "Past, present, future, they're all the same to it. Everyone who travels these roads has always traveled them, will always travel them. You've been driving through Beckwith for 100 years, Mr. Whitlock. You just don't remember all of it yet. A display case near the back contained personal effects. Abner's wallet, though he could feel it still in his pocket. His wedding ring, though it was still on his finger. His daughter's college acceptance letter, aged and yellowed as if it were decades old. And a death certificate, dated October 15th, 1968, listing Abner Whitlock among the 13 miners killed in the collapse. "That's impossible," Abner said, but even as he spoke, memories that weren't his began flooding his mind, working in the mines, the darkness, and the constant danger. The mountain's voice, not heard but felt, promising wealth and demanding sacrifice. The day of the collapse, the mountain closing its throat and swallowing them all. And then, continuing. Not dying, not living, just continuing in service to something older than human understanding. "You've been fighting it," McQuaid said, moving closer. "All these years of driving, you've been fighting the memory of what you really are. But the mountain is patient. It knows you'll remember eventually. You'll take your place with the rest of us, keeping the roads active, bringing new souls to feed the mountain's hunger. It's not a bad existence once you accept it. The fighting is what makes it horrible." The museum walls began to shift and change, becoming rock walls, becoming mine shafts. The ceiling pressed down, and Abner could hear the mountain's heartbeat, slow and steady and ancient. Coal dust filled the air, coating his lungs with every breath. He was drowning in it, suffocating on the weight of stone and time and impossible memories. But then he heard something else, his truck's horn, blaring long and loud from outside. Not controlled by him, but by something else. The sound cut through the mountain's presence like a blade, and suddenly Abner could move again. He ran for the door, McQuaid calling after him, the displays shattering as he passed. The townspeople parted as he reached his truck, their faces showing something like fear. In his cab, on the passenger seat, sat a small figure he hadn't noticed before. A child's toy, a little wooden miner his daughter had made for him in shop class years ago. A Father's Day gift he'd kept on his dashboard until it disappeared during that first night in Beckwith. Now it was back, and it was warm to the touch, almost burning. As his fingers closed around it, he felt something break, some connection the mountain had forged. The town began to fade around him, the restored buildings crumbling back into ruins, the people dissolving into shadow. McQuaid stood in the museum doorway, his form flickering between solid and transparent. "This isn't over," he called out. "The mountain never forgets. You'll be back. They all come back." But Abner was already driving, his truck's engine roaring with more power than it should have. The road ahead shifted and changed, trying to loop back toward Beckwith, but he followed some instinct deeper than thought, taking turns that shouldn't exist, finding passages through the mountains that weren't on any map. The wooden miner grew hotter in his pocket, and he realized his daughter had carved something into its base, words he'd never noticed before. Dad's guardian angel. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, time flowing strangely as he fled through impossible geography. When the world finally stabilized, he was in Ohio, parked at a truck stop he recognized, the sun setting behind him. His phone showed dozens of missed calls from his wife, his dispatcher, his daughter. According to the timestamps, he'd been gone for 3 days, though the trip should have taken less than 1. He made his delivery, collected his pay, and drove home. But he didn't quit this time. He understood now that running from the mountain only gave it more power. Instead, he kept driving, but never alone. The wooden miner sat on his dashboard, a reminder that love could be stronger than whatever ancient hunger lived in those hills. He took other routes when he could, but when work demanded he pass through West Virginia, he drove with purpose and without fear. Sometimes he still heard the singing, still felt the coal dust in his lungs. On storm nights he could sense them out there, Foster McQuaid and Sybil Harper and all the others the mountain had claimed. But they couldn't touch him anymore, couldn't pull him into their timeless prison. The mountain still remembered him, still called to him, but he had found something stronger to hold on to. 5 years passed after that escape from Beckwith's impossible museum. 5 years of Abner Whitlock driving the highways with his daughter's wooden miner standing guard on his dashboard. He'd learned to live with the mountain's presence, the way someone might learn to live with chronic pain or an old war wound that never quite heals. The coal dust in his lungs remained, showing up on no X-ray, but making itself known with every breath. The singing still echoed in his dreams, 13 voices calling from deep beneath the earth. But the wooden figure seemed to keep the worst of it at bay, a talisman of love against the mountain's ancient hunger. His daughter had graduated college, become an engineer, moved to California where mountains were different things entirely. Younger and less hungry. She called him every Sunday, and he never told her how her simple shop class project had saved him from something worse than death. His wife had stopped asking about his nightmares, stopped questioning why he kept every light in the house on during thunderstorms, why he collected maps obsessively, marking routes that avoided certain places with red ink. He developed a reputation among other truckers as someone who knew the mountains better than most, knew which roads to avoid and when. They'd buy him coffee at truck stops, and he'd tell them about weather patterns and traffic conditions, but never about the things that moved through the fog, never about the towns that existed sometimes but not always, never about the roads that led to places that weren't on any map. Some knowledge was too dangerous to share. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when everything changed. Abner was home, enjoying a rare week off when the phone rang. His dispatcher's voice was strange, formal in a way that immediately set off alarm bells in Abner's mind. There had been an accident. Another driver, a young man named Cornelius Ashford who'd just started with the company 3 months ago, had gone missing on a run through West Virginia. His truck had been found abandoned on the shoulder of Route 19, about 2 miles from the Beckwith exit. The engine was still running, the cargo untouched, but Cornelius was gone. The state police were investigating, but the company was conducting its own search. They wanted Abner to help, knowing his familiarity with the area. They'd pay triple rate, hazard pay, plus consultation fees. But it wasn't about the money anymore, hadn't been for years. Abner knew what had happened to Cornelius Ashford, knew where he'd been taken. The mountain had found someone new to feed on, someone who didn't have a wooden guardian or the knowledge to resist its pull. Abner's wife begged him not to go. She'd seen what those mountains did to him, how they aged him beyond his years, how they haunted him even hundreds of miles away. But Abner had already made up his mind. He couldn't leave that young man to the mountain's mercy, couldn't let another soul be added to the 13 that already served that ancient hunger. He packed his truck with things that might help. Road flares, emergency lights, mirrors, anything that might disrupt the darkness that clung to Beckwith. And, of course, the wooden miner, which he wrapped carefully and placed in his jacket pocket. The drive to West Virginia felt different this time. The mountains didn't loom threateningly, but seemed to watch with anticipation, as if they knew something Abner didn't. The weather was clear, almost unnaturally so. The October sky a brilliant blue that belonged more to spring than autumn. His truck ran perfectly. No mechanical issues, no mysterious failures. Even the radio stayed clear, playing classic rock without a hint of static or ghostly transmissions. It felt like a trap, like the mountain was luring him in with false safety. He reached the spot where Cornelius's truck had been found just as the sun was beginning to set. The vehicle had already been towed, but Abner could see the marks on the shoulder, could smell something in the air that didn't belong. Coal dust, of course, but something else, too. Sulfur, maybe, or the scent of rocks that had been deep underground for so long they'd forgotten what sunlight was. He parked his truck and got out, the wooden miner warm in his pocket. The Beckwith exit was visible from where he stood, and for the first time in 5 years he could see lights down in the valley. Not the restored fake town he'd encountered before, but something else. Work lights, the kind used in mining operations. The mountain was active again, or at least pretending to be. As he watched, he saw other vehicles taking the exit. Regular cars and trucks, their drivers seemingly oblivious to what they were heading toward. He followed them down, driving slowly, every nerve on high alert. The road was different again. Neither the deteriorated pathway he'd first encountered, nor the pristine asphalt of the museum visit. This time it was functional but worn, like a working road that saw regular use. As he descended into the valley, he could hear machinery, the rumble and clank of mining equipment that should have been silent for over 50 years. Beckwith had transformed again. This time it appeared as a working mining town, circa 1968, just before the disaster. The buildings were functional but showing their age, the streets busy with people in period-appropriate clothing. But these weren't the hollow-eyed phantoms he'd encountered before. These people seemed real, solid, unaware that they were living in a time that had already passed. He saw children playing in yards, women hanging laundry, men heading home from their shifts with coal dust on their faces and lunch pails in their hands. The mining operation was in full swing at the far end of town. The entrance to the main shaft was lit up like daylight, and Abner could see men going in and out, the cable cars carrying coal up from the depths. Among them, looking confused and terrified, was Cornelius Ashford. He was dressed in mining gear that didn't fit quite right, being led by 2 older miners toward the shaft entrance. Even from a distance, Abner could see the young man was fighting, trying to pull away, but the miners held him firm. Abner parked his truck and started running toward the mine entrance. The townspeople didn't react to him, didn't even seem to see him. He was like a ghost in their recreated world, invisible to everyone except those who were already claimed by the mountain. As he got closer to the mine, Foster McQuaid stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. He looked more solid than ever, more real, as if the mountain's power was growing stronger. "You came back," McQuaid said, and there was something like satisfaction in his voice. "I knew you would. The mountain knew you would. That boy, Cornelius, he's just the beginning. The mountain is hungry after all these years of slim feeding. It wants what it was promised back in 1968. 13 souls weren't enough. It wants hundreds, thousands. Everyone who travels these roads will eventually find their way here." "Let him go," Abner said, his hand closing around the wooden miner in his pocket. The figure was almost too hot to touch now, burning through the fabric. "Take me instead if you need someone. I'm already marked, already halfway claimed. Let the boy go." McQuaid laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together deep underground. "You think you can bargain with the mountain? You think your little trinket protects you? That wooden toy only works because the mountain allows it, because it finds your resistance amusing. But the game is ending now. The boy will go down into the mine and he won't come back up. Neither will you if you try to stop it." But Abner was already moving, pushing past McQuaid, who seemed surprised that he could be touched at all. The miners at the entrance turned toward him, their faces shifting from human to something else, something made of shadow and coal dust. Cornelius saw him and called out, hope flashing in his eyes. Abner grabbed the young man's arm, pulling him away from the miners, and for a moment it seemed like they might escape. Then the ground began to shake. Not an earthquake, but something more deliberate, like the mountain was adjusting itself, repositioning its bones. The mine entrance began to collapse, not in the chaotic way of a natural cave-in, but with purposeful precision, stones falling to create a new configuration. The townspeople finally noticed them, turning as one to stare with eyes that had gone completely black. They began walking toward the mine, all of them, men, women, children, moving with that same mechanical gait Abner remembered. "Run!" Abner shouted, pushing Cornelius toward where he'd parked his truck. But the young man was in shock, his legs barely working, stumbling and falling every few steps. The townspeople were getting closer, and behind them, Abner could see others emerging from the mine, the 13 original victims, still in their mining gear, their faces those of corpses that refused to acknowledge their death. They moved faster than the others, with purpose and terrible intent. The wooden miner in Abner's pocket suddenly burst into actual flames, burning through his jacket. He pulled it out, and it was glowing like a coal from a forge, but somehow not burning his hand. Light poured from it, warm and golden, nothing like the harsh white of the mining lights. The approaching figure stopped, seeming to recoil from the light. Even McQuaid, who had been following them, took a step back. "That won't last," McQuaid called out. "The mountain is older than love, older than hope. Your daughter's protection is burning itself out. When it's gone, you'll have nothing left to shield you." But Abner wasn't listening. He was remembering something his daughter had said when she gave him the figure, something he'd dismissed as a child's fancy at the time. "I carved it from wood that grew over coal," she'd said. "The man at the craft store said it was from an old mine site that got reclaimed by forest. I thought it was perfect for you, Dad, something that grew from darkness into light." The wood was from here, from these mountains, from places where the coal had been taken and nature had reclaimed its territory. It wasn't just a token of love. It was the mountain's own substance transformed, proof that even the oldest darkness could be overcome. Abner held the burning figure high, and its light grew stronger, spreading outward in waves that made the phantom townspeople fade like shadows at sunrise. "Cornelius," Abner said, his voice steady despite everything, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. This place isn't real, not in the way we understand real. It's a memory, a wound in time that won't heal. But memories can be changed. Wounds can be closed. Think about why you're here. Think about what brought you to these mountains." The young man's eyes were wide with terror, but he managed to speak. "My grandfather, he died in these mountains, in a mine collapse, October 15th, 1968. His name was Elijah Ashford. I wanted to see where it happened, wanted to understand why he never came home. Of course, the mountain didn't choose victims randomly. It called to those who had connections, who had blood in the coal, family in the darkness. Cornelius's grandfather had been one of the 13, and now the mountain wanted to complete the family reunion, to add another generation to its collection. "Your grandfather isn't here," Abner said firmly. "Whatever you see, whatever you hear, it's not him. It's just the mountain wearing his face, using his voice. The real Elijah Ashford moved on long ago. His soul isn't trapped here, only his echo, and echoes can't hurt you unless you let them." The burning wooden miner was starting to crack, its light flickering. Around them, the phantom town was beginning to reassert itself, the buildings solidifying, the people becoming more real. But something else was happening too. Other lights were appearing, small at first, but growing stronger. From the forest surrounding Beckwith, from the hills and valleys came points of warm light. Not the cold white of mining lamps, but the warm glow of hearth fires, of home. "What is that?" Cornelius whispered. Abner knew without being told. These were the others, all the souls who had escaped the mountain over the years, all those who had found their own ways to resist its pull. They had come back, not in body but in spirit, to help close the wound that Beckwith represented. Every trucker who had driven past without stopping, every family who had moved away and never returned, every person who had chosen life over the darkness underground. The lights converged on the mine entrance, and where they touched, the phantom structures began to crumble. Not into ruins, but into nothing, dissolving like morning mist. The townspeople faded, their faces showing not anguish but relief, as if they were finally being allowed to rest. Even the 13 miners seemed to pause, their hollow eyes reflecting something that might have been gratitude. Foster McQuaid stood at the mine entrance, no longer looking human at all but like a figure carved from coal itself. "You can't destroy the mountain," he said, his voice echoing from deep underground. "It was here before humans walked these hills. It will be here after you're all dust. This is just a temporary victory." "Maybe," Abner agreed, "but temporary victories are all humans ever get, and we've gotten pretty good at stringing them together into something longer. The mountain might be eternal, but so is the human ability to resist, to refuse, to choose light over darkness." The wooden miner in his hand crumbled to ash, its purpose fulfilled, but the light didn't fade. It had spread to Cornelius, to Abner himself, to the very air around them. The phantom Beckwith was disappearing, revealing the true abandoned town beneath, the honest ruins that time and weather had created. The mine entrance collapsed for real this time, not violently but gently, like the earth was finally closing a wound that had been open too long. Sybil Harper appeared one last time, but she looked different. Younger, cleaner, more like the woman she must have been before the mountain claimed her. "Thank you," she said, her voice no longer hollow but filled with warmth. "The families can rest now. The debt is paid. The mountain will sleep for a while." She faded like the others, but her departure felt like a blessing rather than a haunting. Abner and Cornelius stood in the real Beckwith, abandoned and crumbling but no longer haunted. The sun was rising, painting the mountains gold and green, and birds were singing in the trees that had grown up through the old buildings. The mountain was still there, would always be there, but its hunger had been sated, or at least suppressed. The wound had been cauterized, if not healed. They walked back to Abner's truck in silence, both processing what they had witnessed. As they drove out of the valley, Cornelius finally spoke. "My grandfather, was he really one of them, one of the 13? "Does it matter?" Abner asked. "Whatever he was, he's free now. They all are, that's what matters." They drove back to civilization, and Cornelius never returned to trucking. He went back to school, became a teacher, dedicated his life to preserving the real history of mining communities, the human stories beyond the ghost tales. Abner kept driving for a few more years, but the mountains had lost their terror for him. He could pass through West Virginia without hearing the singing, without feeling the coal dust in his lungs. When he finally retired, Abner moved to a small town in the mountains, not far from where Beckwith lay abandoned. Not because the mountain called to him, but because he had learned that darkness was just the absence of light, and someone needed to keep watch to make sure the lights stayed lit. He became a local historian, collecting stories from truckers and travelers, documenting the real hauntings and the real escapes, creating a map of places where the old darkness still lingered and teaching people how to pass safely through. His daughter visited him there, bringing her own children, and he taught them about the mountains. Not ghost stories, but real history, the lives and deaths that had shaped these hills. And always, he taught them about light, about love, about the human ability to transform darkness into something else. He carved wooden figures for his grandchildren, little miners and truckers and mountain animals, each one made from reclaimed wood, each one a small rebellion against the darkness underground. Foster McQuaid was right about one thing. The mountain was eternal, or close enough to it. But so was human stubbornness, human love, human refusal to go gently into the darkness. And in that balance, that eternal struggle between the hunger below and the light above, there was something like hope. The roads through West Virginia remained dangerous, especially during storms, especially near certain exits. But they were no longer hopeless. The mountain might call, but humans had learned how to hang up the phone. On storm nights, when the wind howled through the valleys and the rain beat against windows, people still reported seeing lights near Beckwith. But they weren't mining lights anymore. They were warm and golden, like campfires or porch lights or the glow from a wooden figure carved with love. They were reminders that even in the darkest places, even in the belly of the mountain itself, light could find a way to grow. And that was enough. It had to be enough. Because the mountain was still there, still hungry, still waiting. But now it knew that humans were waiting too, watching, ready to light their small fires against the darkness. And sometimes, on very clear nights, if you drove past the Beckwith exit at just the right speed, you could see them all. The souls who had escaped, the ones who had resisted, the lights that refused to be extinguished. They stood guard over the roads, an invisible army of ordinary people who had faced the darkness and chosen light instead. Abner Whitlock died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by family, far from any mine shaft or dark valley. But truckers still report seeing him sometimes, standing by the side of the road near dangerous exits, holding up a light to guide them past. Whether it's true or just another mountain legend, one thing is certain. The roads through Appalachia are safer now. The darkness a little less dark. The mountain's hunger held at bay by the accumulated light of all who refused to feed it. And in Beckwith, in the valley where 13 men died in 1968, nature has completely reclaimed the ruins. Trees grow through the old buildings, their roots breaking apart the foundations, their leaves catching sunlight and turning it into life. The mine entrance is sealed, not by human hands but by the patient work of earth and stone and time. And sometimes, on October 15th, locals say you can hear singing. But it's not the grim work songs of miners anymore. It's something else, something lighter. Like a celebration or a farewell, or maybe just the wind through the leaves, carrying the voices of those who finally found their way home. Eustace Pruitt had been driving the Kentucky backroads for 31 years, and in all that time, he'd developed an understanding with these ancient hills. He knew which routes flooded during spring rains, which mountain passes iced over first in winter, and which stretches of asphalt had been patched so many times they were more tar than original road. The big trucking companies preferred their drivers to stick to the interstates, but Eustace had learned long ago that the back roads, for all their challenges, could shave hours off certain runs if you knew how to read them right. That October evening, with a load of agricultural equipment bound for a farm supply store in Hazard, he'd chosen Route 15 through the Daniel Boone National Forest, a winding two-lane that cut through some of the most isolated territory in eastern Kentucky. The sun was already behind the mountains when his engine started making the noise. It began as a subtle clicking, barely audible over the diesel's normal rumble, but Eustace had been driving long enough to know that subtle noises had a way of becoming major problems if ignored. He'd just passed through the tiny community of Campton, really just a collection of houses clustered around a closed general store, when the clicking became a grinding. The temperature gauge stayed normal, oil pressure was fine, but something deep in the engine was failing. He could feel it through the steering wheel, a vibration that shouldn't be there, growing stronger with each mile. The smart thing would have been to pull over immediately, call for a tow, and wait for help. But Eustace knew this stretch of Route 15, knew there was nothing but forest for the next 20 miles. No cell service either, not in these deep hollows where the mountains pressed close on both sides. His CB radio might reach someone, but the chances were slim this time of evening when most local drivers had already gone home for supper. He decided to push on, hoping to make it to the next wide spot in the road where he could at least get his rig completely off the pavement. The grinding got worse, and then came the smoke. Not much at first, just wisps of white vapor from under the hood, but Eustace knew he was done. He spotted a gravel pull-off ahead, probably an old logging road entrance, and managed to coast his dying truck into it just as the engine seized completely. The sudden silence was overwhelming. After hours of engine noise, the forest's quiet seemed to press against his eardrums. He sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, calculating his options. It was at least 15 miles back to Campton, probably 8 miles forward to the next anything that might qualify as civilization. He tried his cell phone first, knowing it was useless but needing to confirm it anyway. No signal, not even a single bar. The CB radio produced nothing but static on every channel. He was well and truly stranded, something that hadn't happened to him in probably 15 years. Eustace climbed down from the cab, grabbing his flashlight even though there was still maybe 30 minutes of dusk left. The damage under the hood was worse than he'd expected. Oil was everywhere, and he could see where something had punched through the engine block. This wasn't a roadside fix. This truck needed a complete engine rebuild. The forest around him was already taking on that peculiar quality it had at twilight, when familiar shapes became uncertain, and shadows seemed to move independently of what cast them. He'd grown up in these mountains, spent his childhood exploring hollers and ridges not too different from this one, but that had been a long time ago. 30 years of driving trucks had given him a different relationship with the wilderness. Now it was something he passed through, viewed through windshield glass, not something he existed within. Standing there on that gravel pull-off with his broken truck, he felt that old childhood unease returning, the awareness of how small a human was compared to these ancient hills. He was weighing his options, debating whether to start walking back toward Campton or wait until morning when he heard the voice. "That's a bad spot for a breakdown, friend." Eustace turned to find a man standing at the edge of the forest, maybe 20 feet away. He was certain the man hadn't been there moments before, hadn't heard any footsteps on the gravel or leaves. The stranger was probably in his 60s, wearing overalls and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, with a face weathered by sun and hard living. He looked like any of 100 mountain men Eustace had encountered over the years, except for his eyes. They were pale blue, so pale they were almost white, and they didn't seem to focus quite right, as if he was looking through Eustace rather than at him. "Engine seized up on me," Eustace said, trying to keep his voice casual despite the unease crawling up his spine. "You live around here?" The man nodded slowly, a gesture that seemed to require more effort than it should. "Got a place about a half-mile through them trees. Name's Zebediah Yates. Most folks that know me call me Zeb." He paused, those pale eyes finally focusing on Eustace's truck. "That's a lot of machinery you're hauling. Agricultural equipment, by the look of it." Something about the way he said it, the knowledge in his voice, made Eustace uncomfortable. The equipment was covered by tarps, not easily identifiable from a distance. "Yeah, heading to Hazard," Eustace replied. "Don't suppose you have a phone I could use? Need to call for a tow." Zebediah shook his head. That same slow, deliberate movement. "No phone. We don't hold with such things, but you're welcome to spend the night. My family's place is just through the woods. We got food, a warm bed. Come morning, my boy can drive you to town." Every instinct Eustace had developed over 3 decades of driving told him to decline politely and start walking. There was something off about this man, something that went beyond the usual mountain eccentricity. But the light was fading fast now, and the temperature was dropping. These Kentucky mountains got cold in October once the sun went down, and he was wearing just a light jacket. 8 miles to the next town was a long walk in the dark, and that was assuming he remembered the distance correctly. "That's mighty kind of you," Eustace heard himself saying. "I'd appreciate that. Let me just lock up my truck." Zebediah waited patiently while Eustace secured his cab and grabbed his overnight bag, a habit from years of unexpected delays. As he followed the man into the forest, leaving the familiar comfort of his truck behind, Eustace couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. The path through the woods was barely visible, just a slight depression in the fallen leaves that suggested people had walked this way before. Zebediah moved with surprising confidence despite the gathering darkness, never stumbling over the roots and rocks that kept catching Eustace's feet. They walked in silence for what felt like much longer than half a mile, the forest growing denser, older, the trees so thick overhead that the last of the twilight barely penetrated. Just when Eustace was about to suggest they'd gotten lost, he saw lights ahead. The Yates place was like something out of another century, a collection of buildings clustered in a hollow, all of them built from logs that had gone gray with age. The main house was 2 stories, with a stone chimney releasing a steady stream of smoke into the evening air. There were several outbuildings, what looked like a barn, a smokehouse, maybe a root cellar built into the hillside. Oil lamps provided the only light, their yellow glow making the windows look like eyes watching their approach. The whole scene should have been quaint, rustic, a piece of living history. Instead, it felt wrong, like a movie set or a museum display, something trying too hard to be what it appeared to be. "Family!" Zebediah called out as they approached the main house. "We got company!" The door opened before they reached it, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was younger than Zebediah, maybe 40, with long dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and wearing a dress that looked homemade. Her face would have been pretty if not for something in her expression, a blankness that reminded Eustace of old photographs where people had to hold still for so long their faces lost all animation. "This is my wife, Prudence," Zebediah said. "Prudence, this here's—" He paused, and Eustace realized he'd never given his name. "Eustace Pruitt," he supplied. "My truck broke down out on the road." Prudence nodded, that same slow gesture her husband had used. "Welcome, Mr. Pruitt. Supper's just about ready. You'll join us." It wasn't a question. The inside of the house was even more disorienting than the outside. Everything was handmade, from the furniture to the dishes to the cloth on the table. There was no electricity that Eustace could see, just oil lamps and candles providing pools of light that made the shadows seem deeper. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, along with something else, something earthier and less pleasant that he couldn't quite identify. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, providing the only heat he could detect. "You'll meet the rest of the family at supper," Zebediah said, gesturing for Eustace to sit in a chair that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of wood. "We don't get many visitors here. This is a treat for us." The way he said treat made Eustace's skin crawl, but he sat anyway, trying to maintain a polite facade while his mind worked on escape plans. He could claim he needed something from his truck, make a run for it. But then what? Walking through those woods in the dark would be dangerous, even if the Yates family was completely normal, which they clearly weren't. Others began filing into the room, and Eustace's unease deepened into genuine fear. There were too many of them, at least a dozen people of various ages, all with that same blank expression, those same pale eyes that didn't quite focus right. They moved in coordination, like a flock of birds or a school of fish, each aware of the other's positions without looking. There were children among them, ranging from maybe 5 to teenage years, all dressed in handmade clothes that belonged to another era. None of them spoke, just took their places at the long table with practiced precision. The last to enter was a young woman, probably 18 or 19, with the same dark hair as Prudence but with something different in her face. Her eyes, while still that unsettling pale blue, had more life in them, more awareness. She looked at Eustace with what might have been curiosity or sympathy or warning. He couldn't tell which. "This is our daughter, Minerva," Prudence said, noticing Eustace's attention. "Minerva, this is Mr. Pruitt. His truck broke down." Minerva nodded, but unlike the others, her movement was quick, normal, human. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Pruitt," she said, and her voice too was different, containing inflections and emotions the others lacked. She took a seat across from him, and he noticed how the other family members seemed to shift slightly away from her, as if she was something foreign in their midst. The meal was served in wooden bowls, some kind of meat stew that Eustace couldn't identify. It tasted gamey, wild, not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. No one spoke during the meal except to ask for things to be passed, and even those requests were made in whispers. The only sounds were the clink of wooden spoons against wooden bowls, the crackle of the fire, and somewhere in the walls, a scratching that might have been mice or might have been something else. Eustace forced himself to eat, knowing he'd need strength for whatever came next. He kept glancing at Minerva, who seemed to be the only one actually eating rather than just going through the motions. The others moved food to their mouths, chewed, swallowed, but mechanically, without any sign of taste or satisfaction. It was like watching automatons programmed to simulate a family dinner. "You've been driving these roads long?" Zebediah finally asked, breaking the oppressive silence. Eustace nodded, swallowing a mouthful of the strange meat. "About 30 years, give or take." Zebediah's pale eyes seemed to brighten slightly. "Then you know about the old families, the ones that were here before the government made the forest a park." It wasn't really a question, but Eustace nodded anyway. He did know the stories, families that had lived in these hollers since before Kentucky was a state, forced out when the Daniel Boone National Forest was established, some of them refusing to leave, becoming squatters in their own ancestral homes. "We never left," Zebediah continued, confirming what Eustace had already suspected. "This land's been ours for 200 years. The government says it belongs to them now, but the land knows better. The land knows who its real children are." The others around the table nodded in unison, that disturbing synchronized movement that made them seem like extensions of a single organism. Only Minerva remained still, her eyes fixed on her bowl. "Must be hard living out here without modern conveniences," Eustace said, trying to keep the conversation normal, trying to pretend this was just a backward family and not something far stranger. Prudence made a sound that might have been a laugh but came out more like a cough. "Modern conveniences," she repeated. "That's what destroyed the world outside these woods. Electricity, telephones, automobiles, all of it just ways to separate people from the land, from what's real. But we found a way to stay connected," Zebediah added, and now his pale eyes were definitely brighter, almost luminous in the lamplight. "The land taught us how, showed us what we needed to do to remain its children." He paused, looking around at his family, all of whom were now staring at Eustace with those same bright eyes. "Would you like to see?" Every instinct screamed at Eustace to say no, to make an excuse, to get out of this house immediately. But he was surrounded, outnumbered, and the darkness outside was complete now. "Maybe after supper," he said, forcing a smile. "That stew's sitting heavy, and I'm pretty tired from the drive." Minerva suddenly stood, the scrape of her chair loud in the quiet room. "I'll show Mr. Pruitt to his room," she said, not looking at her parents. "He must be exhausted." Zebediah's eyes narrowed slightly, but Prudence placed a hand on his arm. "Yes, that's fine, Minerva. The blue room is ready." Eustace followed Minerva up a narrow staircase, the wood creaking under their weight. The upper floor was darker, only a single oil lamp in the hallway providing light. She led him to a room at the end of the hall, opening the door to reveal a sparse but clean space with a bed, a chair, and a small table. The window looked out into complete darkness, not even starlight visible through the glass. "Lock your door," Minerva whispered, so quiet he almost missed it. "No matter what you hear, don't open it until sunrise." Before he could respond, she was gone, moving down the hallway with silent steps. Eustace stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the murmur of voices from below, then stepped inside and turned the old-fashioned key in the lock. The mechanism was well oiled, clicking into place with a solid sound that should have been reassuring but wasn't. He sat on the bed, still fully clothed, trying to make sense of what he'd walked into. The Yates family was obviously isolated, possibly inbred, certainly strange, but was there actually danger here or just eccentricity taken to an extreme? The scratching in the walls had followed him upstairs, louder now, definitely not mice. It sounded deliberate, rhythmic, like something was trying to communicate through the wood itself. Time passed, maybe an hour, maybe more. The voices downstairs had gone quiet, and the house had taken on that peculiar quality of a place where people are awake but pretending to sleep. Then he heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and measured. They stopped outside his door, and he could see shadows moving in the gap underneath. The doorknob rattled gently, testing. Eustace held his breath, Minerva's warning echoing in his mind. "Mr. Pruitt," Zebediah's voice came through the door, soft and reasonable. "The family would like to show you something special. Won't take but a moment." Eustace didn't respond, didn't move, barely breathed. The doorknob rattled again, more insistent. "Mr. Pruitt, it's rude to ignore your hosts. We've opened our home to you." More footsteps, multiple sets now, gathering in the hallway. Eustace could hear them breathing, a synchronized sound like a single pair of lungs with multiple mouths. The scratching in the walls intensified, and he realized it was coming from everywhere, inside every wall of the room, above in the ceiling, below in the floor. Whatever was in the walls was all around him. "He's not ready," he heard Minerva's voice, firm and clear. "The land hasn't chosen him. You know the rules, Father. It has to choose." There was a long silence, then Zebediah spoke again, his voice different now, older, like something speaking through him rather than from him. "The land is hungry, daughter. It's been too long since we fed it properly." "Then find another way," Minerva replied. "This one's not right. You can feel it. The land doesn't want him." Another long silence. Then the footsteps began moving away, reluctantly, slowly. The scratching in the walls continued for a while longer. Then it too faded, leaving Eustace alone in the darkness with his racing heart and the terrible certainty that he'd stumbled into something far worse than just a strange family in the woods. Eustace Pruitt didn't sleep that night in the Yates house. He sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing his boots and jacket, listening to the sounds of the old building settling around him. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind through the gaps in the walls, every distant sound from the forest outside kept him on edge. The scratching in the walls had stopped completely after the family retreated from his door, but somehow the silence was worse. It felt expectant, like the house itself was waiting for something. Around what his watch said was 3 in the morning, though time felt different in this place. He heard something new, singing, or something like singing, coming from somewhere below the house. Not from the first floor, but from deeper, as if there was a basement or cellar he hadn't seen. The voices were numerous but synchronized, rising and falling in harmonies that didn't sound quite right to his ears. The words, if there were words, were in no language he recognized. It might have been English twisted by mountain dialect and echo, or it might have been something older, something that predated any European presence in these hills. The singing continued for maybe an hour, growing gradually louder, more intense. At its peak, Eustace could feel it vibrating through the floorboards, traveling up through his boots into his bones. Then it stopped, cut off mid-note as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed was so complete it made his ears ring. He waited, muscles tense, for something to happen, but nothing did. The house remained quiet for the rest of the night, though he never relaxed enough to even close his eyes. First light came as a relief, pale gray, seeping through the window to reveal a view of forest shrouded in morning mist. Eustace stood, his joints protesting after hours of sitting in the same position, and approached the window. The Yates compound looked different in daylight, more run down than sinister. He could see the barn better now, its roof partially collapsed, and what looked like animal pens, though he couldn't see any animals. There was a garden plot, surprisingly well maintained, with autumn vegetables still growing in neat rows. It all looked so normal, so mundane, that he almost convinced himself he'd imagined the strangeness of the night before. A soft knock at his door made him jump. "Mr. Pruitt?" It was Minerva's voice, quiet but clear. "Breakfast is ready. And my father's son from his first marriage, Josiah, he's here with his truck. He can drive you to town after you eat." Eustace unlocked the door to find her standing in the hallway, looking tired but otherwise normal. In the morning light, even her pale eyes seemed less unsettling, more like a genetic quirk than something supernatural. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough from the sleepless night. "Minerva, I need to ask you something. Last night, your family, the things your father said about the land." She held up a hand, stopping him. "Not here," she whispered. "The walls listen. Come to breakfast. Eat quickly. Get to town, don't come back." The urgency in her voice told him more than her words did. Whatever was happening here, she wanted him gone as much as he wanted to leave. The family was already gathered around the table when they came downstairs, but the atmosphere was different from the night before. They seemed sluggish, drained, like people recovering from an illness or a long night of hard labor. Zebediah barely looked up when Eustace entered, and Prudence served breakfast, some kind of grain porridge with preserved fruit, without speaking. The synchronized movement from the night before was gone. Now they moved independently, though still with that strange mechanical quality. A younger man sat at the table's end, clearly not from the immediate family. He was perhaps 30, with darker hair and brown eyes that looked startlingly normal after all the pale blue ones. "This is Josiah," Zebediah said without enthusiasm. "He'll take you to town." Josiah nodded, not quite meeting Eustace's eyes. There was something ashamed in his expression, or maybe afraid. Eustace ate quickly, barely tasting the food. The scratching had started again in the walls, faint but persistent, and he noticed how the family members would occasionally pause, tilting their heads as if listening to something only they could hear. Once, they all turned to look at the same spot on the wall simultaneously, their pale eyes tracking something invisible moving across it. Only Minerva and Josiah didn't participate in these moments of shared attention. "We should go," Josiah said. as soon as Eustace put down his spoon. "Long drive to town, and I got work to get to." His eagerness to leave was palpable. Zebediah's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't object. "Thank you for your hospitality," Eustace said, standing. The words felt hollow, ridiculous given the circumstances, but social niceties seemed important somehow, like they might protect him from whatever was really happening here. The walk back through the forest was different in daylight. Eustace could see now that what had seemed like a barely visible path the night before was actually well worn, with steps cut into the steeper sections and logs laid across muddy spots. It was old, this path, older than the Yates family's presence here. The trees around them were massive, ancient oaks and poplars that had probably been here since before European settlement. The forest felt watchful, but not hostile, like it was reserving judgment. His truck sat where he'd left it, looking absurdly modern and out of place on the gravel pull-off. Josiah had brought a beat-up Ford pickup that had seen better decades, rust eating through the wheel wells and doors. "Hop in," he said. And Eustace noticed his accent was different from the rest of the family, less isolated, more touched by the outside world. They drove in silence for the first few miles, Josiah navigating the winding road with the confidence of someone who'd driven it countless times. Finally, when they were well away from the pull-off and the path to the Yates compound, he spoke. "You're lucky Minerva was there. Real lucky. They don't usually let people leave once they've been brought to the house." "What do you mean, let people leave?" Eustace asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Josiah was quiet for a long moment, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "My father, Zebediah, he found something in those woods when he was young. Or something found him. Changed him, changed the whole family. Well, the ones that stayed, anyway. My mother, his first wife, she got me out when I was 10, saw what was happening and ran. But the others..." He trailed off, and Eustace could see him struggling with how much to say. "The others stayed," Eustace prompted. Josiah nodded. "They feed it. Whatever's in those woods, under that land, they feed it. Animals mostly, deer and such. But sometimes..." He stopped again, shaking his head. "Sometimes hikers go missing in the Daniel Boone. Cars break down on this road and people vanish. Not often, maybe once every few years, but enough." The implication hung heavy in the truck's cab. Eustace thought about the meat stew from the night before, its unfamiliar taste, and his stomach turned. He started, but couldn't finish the question. "You were supposed to be," Josiah admitted. "Your truck breaking down right there, that wasn't coincidence. The land, it can do things. Mechanical things especially. It can make them fail. It's been getting stronger, hungrier. But Minerva, she's different. She's resisted it somehow, kept some part of herself separate. She convinced them you weren't right, that the land hadn't chosen you." "Why does she stay?" Eustace asked. "If she knows what they're doing, why doesn't she leave?" Josiah's expression darkened. "You can't leave if you've been claimed. The few who've tried, the land brings them back. Dead or alive, it brings them back. Minerva's been claimed since birth, born into it. She's trapped, but she does what she can to minimize the damage, to save people when possible." They were approaching the outskirts of a small town now, buildings appearing through the trees. Eustace could see a gas station, a diner, normal signs of civilization that seemed almost miraculous after the night he'd had. "What should I do?" he asked. "Should I report this to someone?" Josiah laughed, bitter and short. "Report what? That a strange family in the woods made you uncomfortable? That you think something's living under their land? They've been there for generations. Local law knows to stay away. State police won't find anything if they look. The land hides what it wants hidden. He pulled into the gas station and parked. There's a mechanic here who can arrange a tow for your truck. Don't go back for it yourself. Let someone else handle it, someone who doesn't know where you spent the night. He paused, then reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. Minerva wanted me to give you this. Said it might help if the land tries to follow you. Eustace unwrapped the cloth to find a small piece of wood, carved with symbols he didn't recognize. It was warm to the touch, almost uncomfortably so. "What is it?" he asked, but Josiah was already backing away. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. Minerva knows things, old things. If she says it'll help, it probably will. Just don't come back to this part of Kentucky. Ever. The land has a long memory, and it doesn't like being denied." With that, Josiah got back in his truck and drove away, leaving Eustace standing in the gas station parking lot with the carved wood in his hand and the memory of the night burning in his mind. He arranged for the tow, caught a ride to the next town where he could rent a car, and eventually made it to Hazard to explain the delay to his employer. But he never forgot the Yates family, never stopped wondering about Minerva trapped in that house, never stopped feeling grateful for whatever instinct or intervention had saved him from becoming another missing person in the Daniel Boone National Forest. The carved piece of wood sat on his dashboard for the rest of his trucking career, a reminder and a warning. And he kept his promise to Josiah, never driving through that part of Kentucky again, even when it would have saved hours on a run. Some shortcuts, he'd learned, cost more than time. Some roads led to places that existed outside the normal world, where different rules applied and different hungers needed to be fed. But the story didn't end there. 3 years after his night at the Yates compound, Eustace was at a truck stop in Tennessee when he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. 2 drivers were discussing a colleague who'd gone missing on Route 15 through the Daniel Boone National Forest. His truck had been found on a gravel pull-off, engine seized, no sign of the driver. The description of the location was unmistakable. It was the same spot where Eustace's truck had broken down. He inserted himself into the conversation, trying to sound casual. "Route 15 can be tricky," he said. "Lots of places to break down with no cell service." One of the drivers, an older man with a gray beard, nodded. "That's what's strange about it." Mike was experienced, knew these roads, and his truck was new, well-maintained. No reason for the engine to seize like that. The other driver, younger and clearly spooked, added, "State police found something weird too. Footprints leading into the forest, but they just stopped about 50 feet in, like he vanished into thin air." Eustace felt the carved wood in his pocket grow warm. He'd taken to carrying it with him always, not just leaving it in whatever truck he was driving. "Did he have family?" he asked, though he wasn't sure why it mattered. "Wife and 2 kids," the older driver said sadly. "Company's organizing a search party, going out this weekend. A lot of volunteers signed up." Eustace knew he should stay away, knew that returning to that area was dangerous, but he also knew what had likely happened to Mike, and he couldn't let others walk into the same trap. "I'll volunteer," he heard himself saying. "I know that area pretty well." That weekend, he found himself back on Route 15, part of a convoy of vehicles heading to the search staging area. The carved wood in his pocket was almost painfully hot now, and he could feel something in the air, a presence that recognized him. As they passed the pull-off where Mike's truck had been found, and where his own had broken down 3 years earlier, Eustace saw something the others didn't. A figure standing at the forest's edge, barely visible in the morning mist. It was Minerva, looking exactly as she had 3 years ago, not aged a day. She met his eyes across the distance, and he saw her lips move, forming a single word. No. Then she was gone, vanished into the forest as if she'd never been there. But her warning was clear. The search party was in danger. The land was hunting, and it wouldn't be satisfied with just Mike. The search was organized with military precision, groups of 4 spreading out through the forest in a grid pattern. Eustace made sure he was in the group assigned to search the area leading toward the Yates compound, though he didn't mention knowing about it. His group consisted of himself, 2 local volunteers who seemed to know the forest well, and a young state police officer who kept checking his GPS unit and frowning at the readings. "Something wrong with your equipment?" Eustace asked the officer, though he suspected he knew the answer. "It keeps glitching," the officer replied. "Shows us in different places every few seconds. Must be interference from the mountains or something." It wasn't interference. It was the land itself, warping their perception of space, trying to lead them astray. They'd been searching for about an hour, finding nothing but disturbed leaf litter that could have been caused by any passing animal, when Eustace heard it. That scratching sound, the one from the walls of the Yates house, but now coming from the trees themselves. The others didn't seem to notice at first, but gradually they all stopped, looking around uneasily. "You hear that?" one of the volunteers asked, a local man named Carl, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. "Sounds like something's in the trees." The scratching grew louder, surrounding them, and Eustace realized with cold certainty that they were being herded, pushed in a specific direction, toward the Yates compound. "We need to go back," he said urgently. "Now. This area isn't safe." The state police officer looked at him skeptically. "We haven't finished our grid. And what do you mean, not safe? You know something about this area?" Before Eustace could answer, the second volunteer, a younger man named Dennis, pointed through the trees. "There's a building over there. Looks like an old cabin or something." It wasn't a cabin. Even from a distance, Eustace recognized one of the Yates outbuildings. They'd been led here despite supposedly searching in a grid pattern that should have taken them in a different direction entirely. The land had folded space somehow, brought them where it wanted them. "Don't go near it," he said, but Dennis was already walking toward the structure, drawn by curiosity or something else. The building was the smokehouse he'd seen from his bedroom window, but it looked different now. Older, more decrepit, with symbols carved into the doorframe that hurt to look at directly. Dennis reached for the door handle, and Eustace grabbed his arm. "Don't," he said firmly. "Trust me, you don't want to see what's in there." But it was too late. The door swung open on its own, revealing darkness that seemed to swallow light. And from that darkness came a smell. Meat, yes, but meat that had been cured in ways that weren't meant for normal consumption. The officer shone his flashlight into the opening, and for a moment, Eustace saw shapes hanging from hooks. Shapes that were the wrong size and configuration to be deer or cattle. The officer stumbled backward, his face pale. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Are those?" He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. They all knew what they were looking at. Carl was already on his radio calling for backup, his voice shaking, but the radio produced only static. That same dead air Eustace remembered from 3 years ago. Then they heard voices approaching through the forest. The Yates family, all of them, moving through the trees with that synchronized gait Eustace remembered. Zebediah was in the lead, looking unchanged from 3 years ago, those pale eyes bright with something that might have been hunger or anticipation. Behind him came Prudence and the others, all except Minerva. "You brought them back," Zebediah said to Eustace, his voice carrying that same otherworldly resonance. "The land remembers you. It's been calling for you." The family spread out, surrounding the search party, moving with predatory precision. The scratching in the trees intensified, and Eustace realized it was coming from inside the trees, from things living in the wood itself. "Run," he told the others, pulling out the carved wood Minerva had given him. It was burning hot now, almost too hot to hold, but he gripped it tight. "Run, and don't look back." But where could they run? The forest around them seemed to shift and change, paths appearing and disappearing, distances becoming fluid. Carl tried to move toward what should have been the way back, but somehow ended up closer to the smokehouse. Dennis turned to run in the opposite direction, but found himself facing the Yates family again. The officer pulled his service weapon, pointing it at Zebediah with shaking hands. "Stay back," he warned. "I'll shoot." Zebediah smiled, an expression that looked wrong on his face, like something pretending to be human had learned the gesture but not the emotion behind it. "Bullets don't harm what we serve," he said. "The land is older than your weapons, older than your laws." That's when Minerva appeared, stepping out from behind a massive oak tree. But she was different now, changed. Her pale eyes were brighter, almost luminous, and her skin had taken on a grayish cast like stone or old wood. She looked at Eustace with something like regret. "I tried to warn you," she said. "Tried to keep you away, but the land wants what it wants, and even I can't deny it forever." The carved wood in Eustace's hand suddenly cracked, splitting along invisible fault lines. As it broke apart, he heard a sound like screaming, though whether it came from the wood or from something in the forest he couldn't tell. The pieces fell to the ground, smoking and turning to ash within seconds. His protection was gone. The moment the carved wood turned to ash at Eustace Pruitt's feet, the forest around them changed. Not physically, not in any way that could be captured on camera or described to someone who hadn't experienced it, but fundamentally. The air became thick, almost solid, like trying to breathe underwater. The trees, which had been imposing but natural before, now seemed to lean inward, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers, and the ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as if they were standing on something alive, something that could open up and swallow them at any moment. The state police officer fired his weapon, 3 shots in rapid succession aimed at Zebediah Yates. The sounds were muffled, wrong, like firing a gun inside a dream. The bullets hit their target. Eustace saw them hit, saw Zebediah's body jerk with the impacts. But the old man didn't fall. He looked down at the holes in his chest with mild interest, then back up at the officer. No blood flowed from the wounds. Instead, something dark and viscous seeped out, something that moved with purpose, crawling back into the wounds and sealing them. "I told you," Zebediah said, his voice carrying that otherworldly resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself. "We don't die like normal folks anymore. Haven't for years. The land keeps us going, long as we keep it fed." He took a step forward, and the officer stumbled backward, his face pale with shock and terror. Carl and Dennis were frozen in place, their minds unable to process what they were seeing. Minerva moved then, placing herself between the search party and her family. "Father, please, not like this, not in daylight. The outside world will notice. They'll send more people, investigators, federal agents. You know what happened to the Blackwood family over in Bell County when they got careless." Her words seemed to give Zebediah pause. He tilted his head, those pale eyes unfocused as if listening to something only he could hear. "The land is so hungry," he said finally, his voice smaller, almost plaintive. "It's been 3 years since a proper feeding. Mike wasn't enough, just an appetizer. It needs more." Prudence stepped forward, placing a hand on her husband's arm. Her touch seemed to calm him, or maybe it was whatever was speaking through him that calmed. "The girl is right," Prudence said, though her hungry gaze never left the search party. "We must be careful. The old ways are best. Accidents, disappearances, things that can be explained away." Eustace found his voice, though it came out rough and strained. "Mike, the trucker who went missing, is he in there?" He nodded toward the smokehouse, though he immediately wished he hadn't. Zebediah smiled that wrong smile again. "Parts of him. The land doesn't waste anything. What it doesn't consume directly gets preserved, saved for lean times. Though with the way things have been going, seems like it's always lean times now." The officer had found his radio, was trying desperately to call for backup, but the static that came back wasn't normal static. There were voices in it, whispers and cries that sounded human, but weren't quite. Dennis had started backing away slowly, but with each backward step he took, he seemed to get closer to the Yates family rather than further away. The space was folding again, the land itself conspiring to keep them trapped. "You can't keep us here," Carl said, though his voice shook. "People know where we are. If we don't come back, they'll send others." Zebediah laughed, a sound like rocks grinding in a cave. "They always send others. Been sending others for decades. Hikers, hunters, government men trying to map the forest. Some we take, some we let go. The land chooses, not us, but you four. The land has already chosen you." That's when Eustace noticed something that made his blood run even colder. Their footprints, the ones they'd made walking here, were gone. The forest floor showed no sign of their passage, as if they'd never existed at all. And looking at his companions, he could see they were becoming less solid somehow, their edges blurring slightly, like a photograph beginning to fade. "It's taking us," he said, understanding flooding through him. "The land is absorbing us, making us part of itself." Minerva nodded sadly. "It starts slow, but once it begins, there's no stopping it, unless—" She trailed off, looking at her family, seeming to weigh something in her mind. Then she turned back to Eustace. "There is a way, but it requires a trade. The land must be fed, one way or another." "Minerva!" Prudence's voice was sharp, warning. "You know the rules. You know what happens to those who break the covenant." But Minerva stood firm, and for the first time Eustace saw real defiance in her pale eyes. "I'm tired, Mother. Tired of the feeding, tired of the killing, tired of being trapped in this cursed existence. I was born into this, never had a choice. But maybe I can give these men one." She reached into her dress and pulled out something that made the entire Yates family recoil. It was a root, gnarled and ancient-looking, pulsing with a faint light that hurt to look at directly. "This is from the heart of it," she said. "From the thing that lives under our land. The thing my father found all those years ago. It's what binds us, what keeps us alive long past when we should have died, what gives the land its hunger." Zebediah lunged for her, moving with inhuman speed, but Minerva was ready. She threw the root to Eustace, and the moment it touched his hands, the world exploded into sensation. He could feel the forest, every tree, every leaf, every creature living in it. But underneath that he could feel something else, something vast and ancient and utterly alien. It wasn't evil exactly, but it was hungry in a way that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. It had been here before humans, before mammals, maybe before life as we understood it. And it had made a bargain with the Yates family, a bargain written in blood and souls. Through the connection the root provided, Eustace could see the truth of it all. Zebediah as a young man, finding a cave that shouldn't exist, descending into darkness that had no end. The thing he found there, neither plant nor animal nor mineral, but something outside classification. The bargain it offered, immortality and power over the land in exchange for feeding its endless appetite. The gradual transformation of his family as they were pulled into the covenant, willing or not. But he could see something else too. The thing's weakness. It was bound to this specific piece of land, couldn't extend beyond the borders of the original Yates property claim from 1823. And it needed the family as much as they needed it. They were its hands in the physical world, its way of interacting with prey. Without them, it would be just a hungry thing in the dark, unable to feed. "Break it," Minerva said urgently. "Break the root, and you break the connection. The land will release you, have to release you. But," she looked at her family, and there was genuine sorrow in her eyes, "we'll die. All of us. We've been dead for years, really, just kept moving by its will. Without it, we'll be what we should have been long ago." The Yates family had gone still, all of them staring at Eustace with those pale eyes. But now he could see the truth in those eyes, not hunger, but pleading. They wanted this to end too, all of them, even Zebediah. They'd been trapped in this existence for so long they'd forgotten what it was like to be truly human. The land's hunger had become their hunger. Its will had overridden their own, but somewhere deep inside, the original people were still there, horrified by what they'd become. "Do it," Carl whispered. He was fading faster than the others, his form becoming translucent. "Whatever you're going to do it now." The officer and Dennis nodded agreement, though Dennis could barely be seen now, more ghost than man. Eustace looked at Minerva one last time. "What's your real name?" he asked. "Your full name?" She smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from any of the Yates family. "Minerva Sloan. My mother was a Sloan before she married Father. The Sloans lived in the next holler over, normal folks who had the sense to leave when the forest became a park. I always wished I could have gone with them." Then her expression became urgent again. "Now, before it fully claims you." Eustace raised the root above his head and brought it down hard against a rock. The moment it cracked, the world seemed to scream, not audibly, but in a way that bypassed the ears and went straight to the bones. The forest convulsed, trees swaying without wind, the ground rippling like water. The Yates family collapsed as one, their bodies aging decades and seconds, flesh withering, bones becoming visible through papery skin. But on their faces Eustace saw peace. The thing underground roared its fury, and for a moment, Eustace could see it clearly through the connection provided by the broken root. It was vast, a network of something like roots or veins spreading beneath the entire property, all leading to a central mass that pulsed like a heart made of shadow and hunger. It reached for him through the connection, trying to pull him down into itself, to make him the new anchor for its existence. But Minerva, even as her body crumbled to dust, spoke one last word. It was in a language Eustace didn't recognize, older than English, older than any human tongue. The word severed the connection, sent the thing reeling back into its cave, into its darkness. The forest stopped convulsing. The ground became solid again, and suddenly Eustace could breathe properly for the first time since the wooden charm had burned to ash. Carl, Dennis, and the officer solidified, their forms becoming real and present again. They stood in a circle, looking at where the Yates family had been. All that remained were piles of ancient cloth and bones that looked like they'd been lying there for decades. The smokehouse had collapsed, whatever horrors it contained buried under rotting wood. The other buildings were falling apart too, aging years and seconds, returning to the ruins they should have been. "What the hell just happened?" the officer asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What was that thing? Eustace picked up a handful of dust that had been Minerva Sloane, letting it run through his fingers. Something that should have stayed buried, he said. Something that fed on human lives to maintain its existence in our world. The Yates family found it, or it found them, and they've been feeding it ever since. But it's over now? Carl asked hopefully. Eustace wasn't sure how to answer. The thing was still down there, he could feel it. Weak, but not dead. It would sleep now, maybe for decades, maybe for centuries. But eventually, someone else would find that cave. Someone else would hear its whispers, its promises, and the cycle would begin again. They made their way back through the forest, and this time the path was clear, the distance normal. The search and rescue base camp erupted in relief when they emerged, everyone assuming they'd simply gotten lost in the difficult terrain. The officer made a report about finding human remains in an old abandoned settlement, carefully leaving out the supernatural elements. A recovery team was sent, but they found only what Eustace expected them to find: old bones and the ruins of buildings that had clearly been abandoned for decades. Mike's remains were identified through dental records, along with several other missing persons from over the years. The official story was that they'd stumbled upon an old illegal cemetery, probably used by moonshiners or drug manufacturers to dispose of bodies. The case was turned over to federal authorities, who conducted a thorough investigation but found nothing actionable. The land was quiet now, revealing none of its secrets. But Eustace knew the truth, and it haunted him. He quit trucking after that. Couldn't stand the thought of driving past places where things like that might be lurking. He moved to the city, surrounded himself with concrete and steel and electric lights, things that felt solid and real and human. But sometimes, especially on quiet nights, he could still feel that connection, faint but present, to the thing under the Yates land. He did research, spent years in libraries and archives, tracking similar stories across Appalachia. And he found them. Dozens of accounts spanning centuries. Families that had made bargains with things that shouldn't exist, communities that had disappeared overnight, forests that consumed those who entered them. The mountains were full of these ancient hungers, things that had been here before humans and would be here after. 5 years after the incident, Eustace received a package with no return address. Inside was a journal, handwritten in fading ink. It was Minerva Sloane's, hidden somewhere and mailed by someone who'd found it after the investigation. In it, she'd documented everything: the family history, the thing under the land, the names of everyone who'd been fed to it over the years. But more importantly, she'd documented her resistance, how she'd learned to maintain her humanity despite being born into the Covenant. The last entry was dated the day before Eustace had first arrived at the Yates compound. In it, Minerva had written, "The land whispers that another one is coming, a trucker whose line goes back to the old families, though he doesn't know it." Eustace Pruitt, descendant of the Pruitts who once owned the land next to ours, before the thing beneath learned to spread its influence. It wants him specifically, wants to reclaim what it considers its rightful property. But I won't let it have him. I've saved 17 people over the years by convincing the family they weren't right for feeding. I'll save this one too, even if it costs me everything. Someone has to break the cycle. Someone has to end this. Maybe if I save enough souls, it will balance out all the ones we've taken. Maybe then I can finally rest. Eustace sat with the journal for a long time, processing what it meant. He'd been chosen not randomly, but specifically. The thing under the land had been calling to his bloodline, trying to reclaim a connection from generations past. Minerva had saved him, sacrificed herself and her entire family to break that connection. He owed her a debt he could never repay. He thought about publishing the journal, exposing the truth, but who would believe it? And more importantly, would publicity just draw more people to seek out these things, to make their own bargains? In the end, he decided to become a guardian of sorts. He used Minerva's journal and his own research to map the dangerous places, the spots where reality was thin and hungry things waited. He created a network of people who'd had similar experiences, survivors who understood the truth. They didn't fight these things directly, that was impossible, but they could warn people, redirect traffic, sabotage roads that led to dangerous places. They became an invisible shield between the normal world and the things that lurked in the mountain's shadows. It wasn't much, but it was something. 10 years after the incident, Eustace returned to the site of the Yates compound. He didn't go alone. He'd learned that much at least. He brought 3 others from his network, people who'd survived their own encounters with the darkness under Appalachia. They found the land reclaimed by forest. No sign of the buildings except for foundation stones covered in moss. The cave Zebediah had found was sealed, collapsed in on itself, though whether naturally or by some final act of Minerva's will, they couldn't tell. They performed a ceremony there, something cobbled together from various traditions, Cherokee blessings, old European protections, Christian prayers. They didn't know if it would do anything, but it felt necessary. They planted new trees over where the buildings had stood, living things to counter the death that had ruled there for so long. And they left markers, subtle ones that only those who knew what to look for would recognize, warning signs for any who might stumble upon this cursed ground. As they were leaving, Eustace thought he saw something in the forest, a figure in a simple dress, dark hair flowing free instead of pulled back in a bun, pale eyes that seemed at peace, Minerva Sloane, or something that looked like her, standing at the edge of the trees. She raised her hand in what might have been farewell or blessing, then faded into the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. He never saw her again. But sometimes, when he was investigating reports of new incidents in the mountains, he'd find evidence that someone had been there before him. Warning signs placed just right. Potential victims redirected at crucial moments. Dangerous sites mysteriously collapsed or flooded. He liked to think it was Minerva, still saving souls, still fighting the darkness even after death. Or maybe it was just other members of his network, doing their part to keep the ancient hungers at bay. The truth was, the mountains were full of things like what lived under the Yates land. They'd been there long before European colonization, and the indigenous peoples had known about them, had their own ways of dealing with them or avoiding them. But modern people had forgotten those old warnings, had built roads through places that should have been left alone, had awakened things that should have stayed sleeping. All they could do was try to minimize the damage, save who they could, and hope that eventually these things would sleep so deeply they'd never wake again. It wasn't much of a hope, but it was all they had. And sometimes, on good days, when they managed to save someone who would have been lost, it felt like enough. Eustace kept driving for a few more years after returning to trucking, but he was selective about his routes. He avoided Kentucky entirely and certain parts of West Virginia, Tennessee, and Virginia. He kept Minerva's journal with him always, along with a new charm, this one made by a Cherokee elder who understood the old ways of protection. He never had another encounter with the things under the mountains, though he sometimes felt them watching, waiting, testing the boundaries of his protection. When he finally retired for good, he settled in a small town at the foot of the mountains, close enough to monitor but far enough to be safe. He became a local legend of sorts, the old trucker who knew all the stories, all the dangerous places, all the things to avoid. Young drivers would come to him for advice, and he'd tell them which routes to take and which to avoid, though he rarely explained why. Most thought he was just superstitious, but a few recognized the truth in his warnings and listened. The Yates land remained abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The state eventually absorbed it into the Daniel Boone National Forest officially, though the rangers were told to avoid that section. Too dangerous, they were told. Unstable ground and old mine shafts. The real reason was passed down quietly through certain channels, a secret history that existed parallel to the official one. But Eustace knew it was only a matter of time. The thing under the land was still there, weakened but not destroyed. One day, someone would find it again. Someone would hear its whispers, its promises, and the cycle would begin anew. All he could do was make sure the warnings were in place, the knowledge preserved, the network ready to respond. It wasn't victory, but it was resistance. And in the face of something that had existed before humans and would exist after, resistance was the best they could hope for. The mountains kept their secrets, their hungers, their darkness. But they also kept their guardians, the ones who stood between the normal world and the things that should not be. Eustace Pruitt was one of them now, had been since the moment he'd broken that root and severed the Yates family's connection to the thing beneath. He'd carry that responsibility until he died, and hopefully someone else would take it up after him. Because the mountains were patient, but so were the people who lived in their shadow. And as long as there were people willing to stand guard, willing to remember the dangers, willing to save others from the darkness, there was hope. Not hope for victory, but hope for continued resistance, continued survival, continued humanity in the face of things that were utterly inhuman. And sometimes, in the battle between light and darkness, between human and inhuman, between the known and the unknowable, survival was victory enough. 23 years had passed since Eustace Pruitt shattered the root and freed the Yates family from their cursed existence. 23 years of watching, waiting, and protecting travelers from the ancient hungers that lurked in the Appalachian shadows. He was 71 now, his hands gnarled from decades of gripping steering wheels, his back bent from too many nights sleeping in truck cabs. But his eyes remained sharp, especially when it came to spotting the signs that others missed. The two perfect pull-offs that appeared where no roadwork had been done, the patches of forest where no birds sang, the places where compasses spun without reason. He lived alone in a cabin he'd built himself on the outskirts of Hazard, positioned strategically where he could monitor 3 different routes that led through dangerous territory. His walls were covered with maps, hundreds of them, marked with red X's where incidents had occurred, yellow circles where suspected activity had been reported, and green check marks where successful interventions had taken place. The network he'd helped establish had grown to over 200 members across 6 states, all of them survivors or descendants of survivors, all committed to keeping the darkness at bay. It was a Thursday evening in late autumn when everything changed. Eustace was reviewing reports from other network members when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was from deep in the Kentucky mountains, from the region around where the Yates compound had been. He answered with the wariness that had kept him alive all these years. "Mr. Pruitt?" The voice was young, female, nervous. "My name is Rebecca Sloan. I was Minerva Sloan's cousin, from the branch of the family that left the holler back in the 60s. She kept journals, lots of them, hidden all over. We've been finding them as we renovate the old family properties. She wrote about you, about what you did. I think we need your help." Eustace's blood ran cold. He'd thought the Sloan family was safely removed from all this, the smart branch that had gotten out before things went bad. "What kind of help?" he asked carefully. "Something's happening on the old Yates land. I know it's supposed to be abandoned, absorbed into the national forest, but people have been seeing lights there at night, and there's been construction equipment moving in during the day, even though there's no official project approved. My husband works for the Forestry Service, and he says none of this is authorized. But when he tried to investigate, his supervisors told him to ignore it, said it was classified." Classified. That word sent alarm bells ringing in Eustace's mind. Over the years, he'd encountered hints that certain elements within the government knew about the things in the mountains. Not officially, of course, but through back channels, black budgets, programs that didn't officially exist. They usually had the sense to leave these things alone, to maintain the barriers that kept the ancient hungers contained. But sometimes, someone got ambitious, thought they could harness or control these forces. "Have any people gone missing?" he asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. 3 in the last month, Rebecca confirmed. All contractors who were working on whatever's being built out there. The companies say they quit, moved away suddenly, but their families haven't heard from them. And there's something else. I've been having dreams, Mr. Pruitt. Dreams where Minerva talks to me, warns me. I know how that sounds, but in my family, we've learned not to ignore such things. Eustace was already reaching for his jacket. "Where can we meet?" They arranged to meet at a diner in Jackson, a small town about 20 miles from the old Yates property. Eustace made 3 phone calls before leaving. One to Marcus Blackwood, a former Marine who'd had his own encounter with something ancient in the Tennessee mountains and now served as the network's de facto military advisor. One to Sarah Crowley, an anthropologist who specialized in Appalachian folklore and had documented dozens of sites where reality grew thin, and one to Thomas Ravencroft, a retired Catholic priest who'd learned the hard way that not all evil was metaphorical. The diner was nearly empty when Eustace arrived, just a few locals nursing coffee and avoiding eye contact, the way people did in places where everyone knew everyone else's business but pretended not to. Rebecca Sloane was easy to spot. She had the same dark hair as Minerva, the same determined set to her jaw, though her eyes were brown instead of that unsettling pale blue. She was perhaps 35, dressed practically in jeans and a flannel shirt, looking like someone who spent time outdoors, but not by choice. "Thank you for coming," she said as he sat down. She'd already ordered coffee for both of them, and Eustace noticed her hands shook slightly as she lifted her cup. "I wasn't sure you'd believe me. Most people think I'm crazy when I talk about this stuff." "I believe you," Eustace said simply. "Tell me everything." Rebecca pulled out a tablet, swiping through photos she'd taken. They showed construction vehicles on roads that shouldn't exist. Prefab buildings being assembled in clearings that had been solid forest just months before. But what caught Eustace's attention were the symbols painted on some of the equipment. Not construction company logos, but something older, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. "It started 6 months ago," Rebecca explained. "First, just surveyors mapping the area around the old Yates compound. Then they started building, not normal construction. They work mostly at night, and the sounds. My husband was on patrol near there last week, and he said it sounded like drilling, but not into rock. Like they were drilling into something hollow, something that echoed. The cave. They'd found the cave where Zebediah had first encountered the thing beneath the land. Eustace had hoped it would remain sealed, but if someone was actively looking for it, with modern equipment and perhaps old knowledge to guide them. "There's more," Rebecca continued, pulling out a folder of photocopied journal pages. "These are from Minerva's journals, ones we found hidden in the walls of the old Sloane house. She wrote about others, Mr. Pruitt. The thing under the Yates land isn't unique. There's a whole network of them throughout Appalachia, connected somehow, like a root system. And she believed there were people, organized groups, who knew about them and wanted to use them." Eustace studied the journal pages. Minerva's handwriting was precise, scientific almost, documenting observations and theories with meticulous detail. She'd mapped connections between disappearances across multiple states, tracked family lines that had made bargains with these entities, identified patterns in when and where they became active. It was the kind of research Eustace himself had been doing for decades, but Minerva had had an insider's perspective he'd lacked. She called them the harvesters, Rebecca said, pointing to a specific passage. People who knew about the old bargains but thought they could improve on them, make them more efficient. Instead of random feedings, they wanted to industrialize it, turn it into a system. Feed the things beneath regularly and reliably in exchange for something. Power, knowledge, she wasn't sure. Marcus arrived first, his truck pulling into the diner's parking lot with military precision. He was a big man, 6'4", and built like someone who'd never stopped training even after leaving the service. His encounter had been with something in the mountains near Oak Ridge, something that might have been related to the old nuclear facilities or might have been there long before. He never talked about the details, but whatever he'd seen had turned his hair white at 35. Sarah came next, driving a battered Subaru covered in university parking stickers and mud from recent fieldwork. She was small, bookish, the kind of person you'd expect to find in a library rather than trudging through dangerous mountain terrain. But Eustace had seen her face down things that would send most people screaming, armed with nothing but knowledge and an iron will. Thomas was the last to arrive, and the most unexpected. He'd left the priesthood officially, but he still carried himself like a man of faith. Just one whose faith had been complicated by direct experience with things that shouldn't exist. He brought with him a case that Eustace knew contained items the church would deny having, texts and tools for dealing with entities that predated Christianity but had been fought by faithful people for millennia. They convened in the diner's back room, which the owner, who knew Eustace and knew not to ask questions, had cleared for them. Rebecca repeated her story, showed them the photos and journal entries. The others listened without interruption, though Eustace saw Marcus's jaw tighten when she described the nighttime drilling sounds. "It's the Prometheus group," Sarah said finally, her voice certain. "Has to be. I've been tracking rumors about them for years. Defense contractors, officially, but with connections to every black budget program you can imagine. They think the things in the mountains are some kind of untapped resource, like oil or uranium. They don't understand that these entities aren't just powerful. They're fundamentally hostile to human life as we understand it." "How do we stop them?" Rebecca asked. "My husband can't get anyone in authority to listen. The local police have been told to stay away. Even the FBI agent he contacted said it was out of his jurisdiction." "We don't stop them," Marcus said grimly. "We can't. If they're as connected as Sarah says, they have resources we can't match. Best we can do is damage control, try to limit the casualties when things go wrong." But Thomas shook his head. "No, this is different. If they're trying to wake the thing under the Yates land specifically, if they think they can control it." Minerva's journals are clear about what that thing is. It's not just one entity. It's a node, a connection point to something much larger. Wake it properly, feed it enough, and you don't just get local effects. You get regional ones, maybe broader. Eustace had been thinking the same thing. During his encounter 23 years ago, when he'd held the root and felt the thing's true nature, he'd sensed vast connections spreading out like a web. If someone managed to fully activate one node, it might activate others. A cascade effect that could wake things that had been sleeping for centuries. "We need to see what they're doing," he said. "Tonight, Rebecca, can your husband get us past the Forestry Service barriers?" Rebecca nodded. "He's on shift tonight. He can make sure certain areas aren't patrolled for a few hours." They spent the rest of the day preparing. Marcus had brought surveillance equipment, night vision goggles, cameras, devices Eustace didn't fully understand but trusted would work. Sarah had her research materials, including maps that overlaid modern geography with older boundaries, showing where the original Yates property claim intersected with other significant sites. Thomas prepared his tools, blessing water from a mountain spring, preparing oils and salts according to formulas older than the religion that had preserved them. As darkness fell, they drove in 2 vehicles to a forestry service road that Rebecca's husband had marked on their map. From there, it was a 2-mile hike through dense forest to reach the edge of what had been the Yates compound. The trees seemed to press closer as they walked, and Eustace noticed the familiar wrongness in the air, that thickness that meant they were approaching a place where reality wore thin. They smelled it before they saw it. Diesel fumes and something else, something chemical and harsh that didn't belong in the forest. Then, through the trees, lights appeared. Not the warm yellow of the oil lamps the Yates family had used, but harsh white LEDs that turned the forest into a stark landscape of light and shadow. The clearing where the Yates house had stood was unrecognizable, filled with prefab structures, generators, and equipment Eustace couldn't identify. But it was the hole that drew his attention. Where the old smokehouse had been, they'd excavated down, creating a shaft perhaps 30 feet wide that descended into darkness. Metal scaffolding lined the sides and cables ran down into the depths. The drilling Rebecca had mentioned wasn't into rock. They were drilling into the cave system beneath, expanding it, creating easier access to what lay below. Jesus Christ, Marcus whispered, his night vision goggles pushed up onto his forehead. They're strip mining it. Whatever's down there, they're trying to extract it. There were people working even at this hour, figures in hazmat suits moving around the hole's edge, checking equipment, taking readings from devices arranged in ritual-looking patterns around the excavation. And there were others, people who stood perfectly still at regular intervals around the perimeter. Guards, Eustace thought at first, but then he noticed how they stood, that familiar, unnatural stillness he remembered from the Yates family. "Those aren't guards," he said quietly. "Those are offerings. People who've already been claimed." Sarah was taking photos with a camera that didn't flash, documenting everything. "Look at the arrangement of the equipment," she said. "It's not random. They're recreating something. A pattern from... God, I think it's from the Dee manuscripts. John Dee, Elizabeth Verster's court magician. He claimed to have communicated with entities he called angels, but which were almost certainly something else." A sound from the hole drew their attention. Not mechanical, but organic, like breathing from massive lungs. The workers seemed excited by it, clustering around their equipment, taking readings. One of them, apparently a supervisor, was talking on a radio, his voice carrying in the still night air. "Yes, sir, we have response. The entity is reacting to the feeding schedule as predicted. 3 subjects integrated successfully, showing signs of transformation. We should be ready for full activation within 48 hours. Full activation. Eustace felt sick thinking about what that might mean. They'd fed 3 people to the thing already, and were planning something bigger. Much bigger. "We need to get closer," Thomas said. "I need to see what they're using for containment. If they think they can control this thing with technology alone, they're fools. But if they have someone who actually understands the old ways..." They circled around, staying in the tree line, trying to get a better view of the operation. As they moved, Eustace noticed something that made his blood run cold. Carved into trees at regular intervals were symbols, not the geometric patterns from the equipment, but older markings, ones he recognized from Minerva's journals. Someone had been here before the Prometheus group, someone who understood the true nature of what lay beneath. They found a position on a slight rise that gave them a view down into the excavation. The shaft descended perhaps 50 feet before opening into a natural cave system. LED strips had been mounted along the walls, illuminating passages that branched off in multiple directions. But it was what was at the bottom that made them all freeze. It was moving. The thing that Zebediah Yates had found all those years ago wasn't just alive, it was growing. What Eustace had sensed through the root as a network of veins, or roots, was actually more like a fungus, spreading across the cave floor and up the walls in patterns that hurt to follow with the eye. It pulsed with bioluminescence, a sickly green-white that made the LED lights seem warm by comparison. And where it was thickest, where multiple strands converged, there were shapes, human shapes, partially absorbed into the mass, some still moving slightly. "The missing contractors," Rebecca whispered, horrified. But that wasn't the worst part. The thing was responding to the Prometheus group's ministrations, growing toward the feeding points they'd established, following the patterns they'd laid out. They were training it, Eustace realized, teaching it to respond to their commands like some kind of monstrous pet. But you couldn't domesticate something like this. You couldn't make bargains with it that you controlled. The Yates family had learned that, had become slaves to its hunger even as they thought they were its partners. "Sir, we have a problem." One of the workers was staring at a tablet, his voice urgent. "Seismic sensors are picking up movement. Not from our site, from the secondary sites, all of them, simultaneously." The secondary sites. Eustace's worst fears were being realized. They weren't just waking the thing under the Yates land. They were waking the entire network. "How many sites?" the supervisor demanded. 7 confirmed, possibly more. Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, Virginia. They're all showing activity. The supervisor was silent for a moment, then spoke into his radio. "Accelerate the timeline. We proceed to full activation tonight." "No," Sarah breathed. "They can't. If all those sites activate at once..." She didn't need to finish. They all understood it would be a cascade, each awakening triggering others, spreading through the mountains like a wave. Every old bargain would be renewed. Every sleeping horror would wake. Every thin place would rupture. "We have to stop them," Thomas said, already reaching for his case. "I don't know if we can, but we have to try." Marcus was more practical. 5 of us against a full operation? We'd need an army." "We don't need an army," Eustace said slowly, an idea forming. "We need Minerva." They all looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Minerva's dead," Rebecca said gently. "Has been for 23 years. "Her body died," Eustace agreed. "But she's still here. You've been dreaming of her, Rebecca. She's been warning you. She saved me after her body was gone, left signs, redirected threats. She's tied to this land, to this thing, in a way that death couldn't sever. And if anyone knows how to stop this, it's her." It was insane, he knew. But they'd passed beyond sanity the moment they'd entered these woods. The normal rules didn't apply here, at the intersection of the human world and something far older and stranger. "How do we contact her?" Thomas asked, and Eustace was grateful the priest didn't dismiss the idea outright. "The same way the Yates family contacted the thing below," Eustace said, "through blood and intent. Rebecca, you're her blood, her cousin, from the same family line. If anyone can reach her, it's you." Rebecca paled but nodded. "What do I need to do?" Thomas opened his case, pulling out items that seemed to glow with their own light in the darkness. Not Christian artifacts, but older things, preserved by the church but predating it. "We create a circle," he said, "a protected space. Rebecca calls to Minerva while we anchor her to this reality, keep her from being pulled into whatever Minerva exists in now." They worked quickly but carefully, Thomas directing them in creating a ritual circle using salt, silver, and herbs that smelled of earth and age. Sarah contributed her knowledge of the symbols. adding markings that would focus the connection while limiting its scope. Marcus stood guard, watching the Prometheus operation for any sign they'd been detected. When the circle was complete, Rebecca sat in its center, holding a photo of Minerva that had been tucked into one of the journals. Eustace gave her the piece of the broken root he'd kept all these years, the one fragment that hadn't turned to ash. It was dead now, no longer connected to the thing below, but it had been a connection once. Maybe that was enough. "Just talk to her," Thomas said gently. "Like she's here, because in a way she is. She never really left." Rebecca closed her eyes and began to speak. She talked about finding the journals, about the dreams, about the fear she felt watching the Prometheus group's activities. She talked about family, about the Sloanes who had escaped and those who hadn't, about the debt they owed to those who'd been trapped. And she talked about Minerva specifically, about the cousin she'd never met, but felt she knew through the writings left behind. The temperature dropped suddenly, frost forming on the leaves around them despite the season. The lights from the Prometheus operation flickered, and several of their machines began alarming. But in the circle, there was warmth, a presence that felt like summer sunshine in the mountains. "Rebecca!" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, clearly Minerva's but changed, deepened by whatever existence she now inhabited. "You came. I knew you would. The family always had strength. They just forgot how to use it when the land turned hungry." Rebecca's eyes snapped open, but they weren't brown anymore. They were pale blue, like Minerva's had been, like all the Yates family had become. But unlike those dead, hungry eyes, these were full of life and purpose. "Eustace Pruitt," the voice continued, and now Minerva was looking at him through Rebecca's eyes. "You kept your promise. You've been protecting people all these years. But tonight, we need to do more than protect. We need to end this permanently." "How?" Eustace asked. "They've fed it. They're waking the entire network. We're just 5 people against all that." Minerva, Rebecca, smiled sadly. 6 people, and we have something they don't, understanding. They think the thing below is just a resource, just power to be harnessed. They don't understand that it's not from our reality at all. It's an infection, a place where something from outside broke through into our world. The old families didn't make bargains with it. They were infected by it, became part of it while thinking they remained separate. She stood, and the circle's salt line glowed brighter. But infections can be burned out if you're willing to accept the cost. The Prometheus group has actually done us a favor. They've exposed the thing, brought it to the surface, made it vulnerable. And they've activated the network, yes, but that means the connections are open. What flows one way can flow another. "What are you proposing?" Thomas asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected. "A cleansing fire," Minerva said through Rebecca. "Not physical fire. The thing below doesn't burn that way. But spiritual fire, the kind that purifies, the kind that requires sacrifice to kindle." She looked at each of them in turn. "I can do it, but I need anchors in the physical world. People willing to channel that fire, to be conduits for something that will burn out the infection wherever the network touches." "That sounds like it would kill us," Marcus said bluntly. "It might," Minerva admitted. "Or it might just change you, make you something different than you were. The Yates family was changed by serving the hunger. You would be changed by serving the cleansing. It's still a bargain, still a transformation, but one chosen freely, not compelled by hunger." Down in the excavation, activity was intensifying. More workers had arrived, and they were setting up additional equipment around the hole. The thing at the bottom was growing more active, more strands reaching upward, pulsing with that sickly light. "We're running out of time," Sarah observed. "Whatever they're planning, It's happening soon. Eustace made his decision. He'd lived with the weight of that night at the Yates compound for over 2 decades. He'd dedicated his life to protecting others from the mountain's hungers. This was the logical conclusion of that dedication. "I'll do it," he said. "I'm old. I've lived my life. If this can end the threat permanently, it's worth the cost." "And Thomas said immediately. "I've spent years studying these things, trying to understand why God allows them to exist. Maybe this is why, so we can choose to stand against them." Sarah nodded. "My whole career has been documenting these entities. Time to do something more than just observe." Marcus was silent for a long moment, then sighed. "Can't let you all have the glory. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't screw it up." Rebecca, Minerva, looked at them with such gratitude that it transcended the possessed state. "You don't all need to do this. 1 or 2 would be enough to anchor the cleansing." "We're stronger together," Eustace said firmly. "That's always been humanity's advantage. These things are alone, isolated in their hunger. We have each other." The ritual Minerva described was complex, but not impossible. It required them to physically touch the infected mass while spiritually opening themselves to the cleansing fire. The fire would use them as conduits, spreading through the network to every connected node. It would burn out the infection, seal the breaches between worlds, and end the ancient hungers that had plagued these mountains for millennia. But first, they had to get to the thing itself, past the Prometheus group's operation. "I can help with that," Rebecca said, her own personality reasserting itself, though Minerva's presence remained. "My husband isn't the only Forestry Service employee who knows something's wrong here. There are others, locals who've been pressured to stay quiet but don't like what's happening. Give me 20 minutes." She made several calls, speaking in coded language that sounded like normal forestry business but clearly meant something more. Within 15 minutes, they heard sirens in the distance. Then more sirens converging on the excavation site from multiple directions. "Fire," Rebecca explained. "Reported forest fire near the operation. Every agency in 3 counties is responding. They'll have to evacuate, at least temporarily." The Prometheus group tried to resist the evacuation order, but even they couldn't openly defy a dozen fire departments and the state police. They pulled back, taking their essential equipment, but leaving the site itself accessible. They clearly planned to return as soon as the false alarm was resolved. The 5 of them moved quickly, descending into the excavation while the emergency responders were still arguing with the Prometheus supervisor about jurisdiction. The shaft was worse up close, the walls slick with something that wasn't quite fungus, wasn't quite flesh, but something between. The metal scaffolding was already being consumed by it in places, dissolved and incorporated into the growing mass. At the bottom, the thing's true nature was revealed. It wasn't a single entity but a colony, millions of tiny organisms acting as one vast hunger. Where it had absorbed the contractors, Eustace could see the process. Not digestion, but transformation, converting human flesh into more of itself while keeping just enough of the original pattern to maintain a mockery of human form. "This is it," Minerva said through Rebecca. "Form a circle, each of you touching the mass. I'll provide the spark, but you need to be the channels. And remember, don't fight the fire. Let it flow through you. Fighting it is what damages you." They arranged themselves around the pulsing mass. Eustace's hand trembled as he reached out to touch it. The sensation was horrific, cold and hungry, trying immediately to begin the process of absorption. He felt his skin beginning to change, to become something not quite human. Then the fire came. It started as warmth in his chest, where his heart beat with very human rhythm. Then it spread, following his blood vessels, his nervous system, every pathway that made him who he was. But instead of consuming him, it seemed to be using him as a lens, focusing through his humanity into the inhuman mass he was touching. The thing below screamed, not audibly, but psychically, a sound that reverberated through the network of connections it had established over centuries. Eustace felt those connections clearly now, could sense every node, every place where the infection had taken hold. The Yates compound was just one of dozens, scattered through the Appalachians like cancer cells in otherwise healthy tissue. Through the fire, he heard the others. Thomas was praying, not in Latin, but in something older, words that predated Christ but served the same purpose, acknowledging something greater than human existence while affirming humanity's right to exist. Sarah was reciting names, every person she'd documented who'd been lost to these things, making their deaths mean something by remembering them. Marcus was silent, but his presence was like bedrock, solid and unmovable, an anchor that kept them all grounded. And Rebecca Minerva was the fire itself, burning away the infection with a fury born of 23 years of helpless observation. She had saved 17 people during her life, but now she was saving thousands, maybe millions, who would never know how close they'd come to being consumed. The mass began to shrink, its bioluminescence fading from sickly green to white to nothing. The absorbed contractors were beyond saving, too far transformed to recover, but their suffering ended as the thing that had claimed them died. Through the network, Eustace felt other nodes dying too, the infection burning out as the cleansing fire spread along the connections the Prometheus group had so helpfully activated. He heard screaming from above, the Prometheus workers who'd been claimed, the ones standing guard. They were burning too, the infection in them being purified. Some would survive, return to humanity. Others, too far gone, would finally be allowed to die properly. The fire reached the deep places, the original sources of infection where things from outside had first broken through. These fought back, trying to retreat to their own realm, but the fire followed them, sealing the breaches as it went. Eustace felt realities separating, the boundaries between worlds reasserting themselves, becoming solid again after centuries of erosion. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Eustace found himself lying on cold stone, his hand resting on what looked like ordinary cave moss. The massive fungal mass was gone, leaving only natural cave formations. The others were scattered around him, all unconscious but breathing. Rebecca was herself again, her eyes brown, Minerva's presence gone but somehow at peace. They climbed out of the shaft to find chaos above. The Prometheus group's operation was in ruins, their equipment dead, their computers wiped clean. Several of their workers were being treated by paramedics, apparently suffering from what looked like severe allergic reactions, but was actually their bodies rejecting the last traces of infection. The official story, constructed over the following weeks, was that the Prometheus group had been conducting illegal biological experiments that had gone wrong, resulting in the release of a toxic fungus. The company was shut down, its assets seized, its leadership prosecuted for various environmental and safety violations. The true nature of what they'd been attempting was buried in classified files that would hopefully never see daylight. The 5 who'd channeled the cleansing fire were changed, as Minerva had warned. They could sense the thin places now, feel where reality had been wounded, even if it was healing. They became the new guardians, more effective than the old network, because they could feel threats developing before they manifested. But they also carried a burden, the memory of touching something utterly alien and hostile to human life, and the knowledge that such things existed just outside the boundaries of normal reality. Eustace returned to his cabin outside Hazard, but he didn't need his maps anymore. He could feel the mountain's health, sense that the ancient infection was truly gone. The caves were just caves now, The forests just forests, dark and dangerous in natural ways, but no longer harboring things that should not exist in this world. Rebecca Sloan became the keeper of Minerva's journals, adding to them with her own experiences and those of others in the network. She established a proper archive, a resource for future generations in case other infections appeared. Because, as Minerva had written in her final entry, found sealed in a jar buried beneath the old Sloan house, the mountains are old, older than the infections that have plagued them. They existed before the thin places formed, and they will exist after those places heal. Our job is not to defeat the mountains or the darkness they sometimes harbor, but to stand guard at the boundaries, to be the immune system that responds when something foreign tries to take hold. We are not warriors or heroes. We are antibodies, and our purpose is to maintain the health of the world we were born to protect. The Yates land was eventually reclaimed completely by the forest. Within 5 years, no trace remained of either the original compound or the Prometheus excavation. The caves below were sealed, not by human hands, but by natural geological processes that seemed almost deliberate. Birds returned to that part of the forest, and deer trails crossed where buildings had once stood. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was full, locals reported seeing a figure in an old-fashioned dress standing at the forest's edge. Not threatening or hungry, just watching, keeping guard. They said she looked peaceful, finally at rest after decades of struggle. They said she looked like she was home. Eustace lived another 7 years after the cleansing, training new guardians, teaching them to recognize the signs of infection, showing them how to stand firm at the boundaries between worlds. When he died, it was peacefully, in his sleep, his work complete. His funeral was attended by hundreds, people he'd saved directly and indirectly, people who understood that the world was safer because of his sacrifice. The mountains remain, ancient and enduring. They still hold darkness in their valleys and under their stones, but it's natural darkness now, the kind that belongs in this world. The infections are gone, the thin places healed, the ancient hungers finally satisfied by being starved out of existence. But the guardians remain too, watching, waiting, ready to respond if new infections appear. Because the universe is vast and full of things that don't belong in our reality, and as long as humans exist, there will be those who stand at the boundaries, keeping the foreign darkness at bay, maintaining the health of the world through their vigilance and, when necessary, their sacrifice. The Kentucky backroads are safer now, though truckers still tell stories about the places where reality seems thin, where the forest presses too close, where engines fail for no mechanical reason. They pass these stories down like warnings, like protective charms, never knowing how close to the truth they come. And somewhere, in journals and archives carefully maintained, the real story waits, ready for the next generation of guardians who might need to know what once lurked in these mountains, and what might lurk there again if the watch is ever abandoned.